Introduction. During a long life spent solely in this lovely village, I have listened to 1,000 tales, and told 1,000 more, some to make you laugh, some to make you cry. Some I dare not tell again to anybody, but on lots of occasions, perhaps after a good laugh, or when they have wiped their tears away, the listener will have said, "You should write all these tales down, they are the life of the place, so here goes." My folks have not been far away from these hillsides for several hundred years. My wife's folk too. She is George Walker's granddaughter, the George Walker of George Walker's leather mill at Kitson Hill. Our story is largely geared to the horse period. Motors had not arrived yet. Horses, I suppose, are my first love, inherited, I should say, from my parents, whose people were both in the livestock business, a job which I have had the good fortune to be able to continue. The horse is usually associated with a more leisurely approach to life and its problems, although there was a greater degree of organization in a business which was horse-operated than we are apt to be aware. The stagecoach period is an example of a very tight timetable. My father drove one when he was in his early 20s. Those were the days, eh? Generally, horses got you there and back, and were fairly reliable. The period which our story covers, roughly 150 years, was a make-or-break time for the area. Until perhaps 25 years ago, we had survived more or less intact. Now the face of the village is scarred and blurred almost beyond recognition, but it is still a lovely place. Walk on East Thorpe Lane on a summer's morning, see the few stalls in front of the Bull, look in Charlie Ramsden's shop, Jonah's Beardsall, Herbert Sr., Jackson's boot shop, Smith's, all tied up with the past. Long may they continue to do so. The survival of the area over a long period was made safe by the efforts of a few well-known families, whose knowledge of the skills required, both in industry, building and agriculture, enabled the village to generally, not only to survive but to keep abreast of the altering times. As long as we have plenty of Ellises, Sheards, Jacksons and of course, any amount of more good people, we can look forward to a continuance of the place as we know it. For a lot of my information, I relied on a source on tap at home. I have 9 brothers and sisters, some of whom would be nearly 100 years old had they lived. They were blessed with good memories and could go back to the year nearly. Between them they had a huge fund of records of the long past. May God rest them. F. G. Pilling. Chapter 1. We'll walk from the fountain to Witley Hall, from the Swan Inn to Yetton Moor, from the Three Nuns to the Woolpack at Witley, and from the Ship Inn to Bradley Bar, and from the Old Flower Pot at Hopton, all uphill and never down dale, until we come to the Old Hall at Lisle Lay, and from there we begin our tale. Before we leave our place at Wateroyd, just take half a turn. You can see the white stone erected to the memory of Caroline Ellis, who was murdered, along with her employer, James Wraith, and his wife, in the famous Mirfield murders at Wateroyd Hall on May 12, 1847. 2 tinkers, Michael McCabe of Dewsbury, and Patrick Reed from Robert Town, were arrested. McCabe turned Queen's evidence and was pardoned. McCabe later returned to the area and hawked gypsy fashion for a long time. The inquest was held, I believe, in the old King's Head that adjoined the scene, but later in the school higher up the lane. An old type print depicting the scene used to hang in the bar there. Reed was hanged at York. The deadly tools used in the murder, a soldering iron and a razor, were recovered from a well in the nearby field. Jane Frost, an old witch, well no less, later drowned herself in the same well. It was filled in and piped away through the nearby field into a trough. It was never known to run dry, even in the driest time. During subsequent building operations, a house was built over this trough. I wonder if old Janie ever calls on them? During the 1939 to 1945 war, the well was uncovered by a collapse of soil, At this time my son, who was a sailor and on leave from his ship, scrambled down the exposed steps but did not find anything of note. The Old King's Head pub was the oldest pub in the village and would date from the 15th century, its cellar unique in that it was cut from solid rock. During its lifetime it had a fairly notorious history, and being the first pub after leaving the Mirfield moorage by Cripplegate, it was the rendezvous of doubtful characters who were cutting across country to escape any pursuers. Our account later of the highwayman Nevison, who was a frequenter of this area, was one of many of similar types and characters. Later, during the lifetime of the adjoining pit, it became more respectable, and was the calling place for a great number of men in business usually associated with the horse and livestock trade generally, and on several nights a week, a bank manager or two, perhaps putting two and two together. Perhaps a poacher or two would turn up with a rabbit to raffle at a penny a time, or if near Christmas, could you do with a good fat goose? At one period an armed war, although at most times silent, usually persisted between the keepers and the poachers. If you listened in the King's Head bar you would hear all that mattered. One night I saw the belly of a well-known fellow that had been well and truly peppered with shot. In fact it looked all of a piece, and had happened weeks before on a rabbiting expedition. The keeper's employer had tried to make amends by visiting the victim in hospital, and so it was said paying him a lot of money to let the business lie on the table. I believe that this was the end of this matter, but the forerunner of another case that finished in court, when a keeper was threatened with everything up to death. He arrested the fellow, hauled him to Dewsbury, where he was fined 57 shillings and 6pence. An impossible sum at that time for a working lad. When you think that most of these escapades were not concerned with game, but usually rabbits for the pot, you see how loaded the whole business was against the man who wanted a rabbit for his dinner. On the other side of the coin, some keepers that I knew carried a thriving trade in trapped rabbits. A well-known landlord who kept a fast-driving horse on the other side of the river used most nights to run these rabbits into Bradford or Leeds markets, and be back at home in the early hours with a rubber-tied cart as if nothing had ever happened. Other characters used to add to the scene at the old pub: two couples, Soldier Harry and wife, and Old Pancrack and wife. Soldier Harry lived very precariously on a tiny pension, and by getting loads of coal in for people at 3pence a go. Pancrack and his wife sold a concoction they called wash liquor at 2pence a go from a donkey and cart. Previously they had kept a pub called the Blacksmith's Arms at Shepley Bridge. The atmosphere there was very much left bank, in fact too much for the bobbies, who I think turned him out. The tales he used to tell, terrible. Occasionally the ladies would form a singing duo, their favourite song being Mona, the collier's dying child, which the lassies would sing with gusto just one more time, all night and nearly to the next morning. One night Mrs. Soldier Harry was telling some lads all about her being on the stage. Some wit reminded her that the stage was at Liverpool on her way from the Emerald Isle. Ah, I was there too, it's true saw, but I learned my trade in the far west of Ireland. What trade? They called. It's singing that suits me, and saw, I can sing all day some days, other days why saw, I'm reminded of home, and the song gets fast in me throat, and if I might say so saw, this a day of that sort today, and if you please to disuse me saw, I shall have to get across the yard some way, and fairly fast, and when I get back saw, I'll sing better for it. I feel full o' wind like that fizzy stuff that old Pancrack sells. I's full to the top with it I am, or else it's the thin beer we're getting. My father-in-law used to say Pancrack the empty whiskey bottles which we had. He would stand under our kitchen window and nearly fall over backwards when he supped them. He little knew they had been supped many times before he got them. We got them from Tetley's at Leeds. 4 bottles of whiskey at 7 shillings and 6 pence a time, and a 9-gallon barrel of beer for 9 shilling. Charlie Harrison, Tetley's man, used to gang to the beer and have the first pint. If there's a jenny donkey between the church on the hill at Hopton and the flower pot by the river, and from there to Wateroyd, and the same Connemara Ginny is seeking a husband, why it's sure I am that the little woman and her pancrack will know. But their sweet jackass will have got to know before them, no less. Once, with a truss of hay on his back from Walt Hunter's on Cripplegate, he heard the signal from across the valley and would have been away with the hay besides, but he stopped to rot and scream, and when just stopped they got him. Sometimes he rots for fun, and sometimes when he's courting, just a sweet whimper, or so it seems. One night I was singing the Mona song in this very pub. I was a bit way off from the little woman, but she had a good voice that night. I could hear but not see. I stopped to get me wind, and believe me saw it was the ass I was singing to. He had a better voice than her that night. Although at another time I blamed the donkey for the poor song, but it was the little woman herself which sang. The next day I told the father I had blamed the poor ass for the offence he never did. There is a saint for the ass, but I forget his name. She said she used to sing a lot better if she cleaned her specs a bit, so one night after a party she takes her specs from her hair, gives them all a great polish with a drop from one of their bottles. She got a glass of the thin beer for herself, she did not for me though. The pancrack had a pint of the stuff for himself. I thought, never mind to you, I'll have the best drink in the pub when I've finished my next song. A man from the bank is here, a farmer or two, a butcher or two, a corn miller, a leather man. These are the men who are likely to pay. But this night, I decided to sing in the Gaelic saw. These are the fine fellows who understood the old tongue about the mountains and the glens, but told to them like my mother used to sing to me, whereas the man said, where the mountains of Mourne fall down to the sea. I'm very good at the Gaelic. I think I could do it when I was with my old mother, and on a night my youngest brother left our cabin and its storm-washed doorway, my mother sang to him before he went to America. She was telling him not to forget the £10 in the Gaelic she had lent him, and never mind the £5 he owed his dad. I put all the words in just as she did. But I was taken in with the company. If they understood the Gaelic saw, they did not show it, and believe me saw. A story I was told about the crew I sang to proved to be true. I was told that compared to these gentlemen, the great Tipin, the robber and highwayman, was like a bishop, or the Pope himself. They would strip him and leave him stark naked, and he not knowing at the time. But just one old farmer said I had sung very well. I had beaten Toad Fussack any road, and I could have just a little sup o' whiskey which he pinched from the man sitting by him. But worse was to follow. When Pancrack came round the corner he laid his head on the bar, and said he thought we'd been having a wake, and the poor ass had been singing. Had my poor mother seen me this night saw, and heard me sing like an old Irish prince in the Gaelic besides, and watch these people who had just crept off the moor to the pub because it was warm, and them to compare me with the Pancrack's ass, she would have made me walk to Liverpool with her the same night. So much for these singing lasses and the wild nights at the old King's Head. Soldier Harry had indeed been a soldier of the Queen, my lads, although his wife said that apart from partly killing her many a time, he had never killed anybody in all his life. At one time he lived in some property belonging to my wife's family. Harry paid £1 a week for the house, a greengrocer paid £1 and 2 pence for the stables. Times change, don't they? The whole of this area is of tremendous historical interest. Prior to the compiling of the Domesday Book it was the most important part of Mirfield, which was then largely in the Northolt district. The large area which we know as Westfields was subsequently mentioned in the Domesday Book as the place where the food required by the inhabitants of Mirfield, that is the old Mirfield of Northorpe, was grown. It was farmed largely on what we now call the Saxon strip system. A certain proportion was left fallow each year. This was largely to allow the weed problem to be dealt with and also to allow the land to recuperate from the fairly intensive cropping program that was very common at that time. Records prove that they were very efficient, especially when we take into account the implements to hand. Turnips and other roots at this time were unknown, but good crops of oats, wheat and barley were grown along with limited amounts of linseed, the actual seeds for use as cattle food, and the like, or flax, for linen weaving, although there is not much evidence of this being practiced locally. The area abounded in game, but the game law which had been in existence since the Norman invasion, that is 1066, were very oppressive, and the ordinary fellow could not enjoy the abundance that nature provided at the time. The centuries which have passed have seen very little modification of the laws. In my time I have seen men, indeed whole families, prosecuted for the taking of a rabbit. Until very recent times partridge were very common here, hare abounded. I once counted 15 altogether. One April day a well-known Mirfield tradesman got 2 hares with 2 shots. In this case, which happened perhaps 30 years ago, he was threatened with the direst penalties. Fortunately, no corpse could be produced. The whole of this land was held and farmed on a communal or common basis. Perhaps this ceased when Mirfield Church and 50 acres of land along with additional tithes, wood, etc., were granted stolen or just taken over by Kirklees Priory, and there was terrific opposition to this exercise, which extended up to papal level. All this land was very intensively farmed until the late 1950s, when the builders laid their hands on it with the only 2 obvious results. It had been farmed from the year dot, or at least since the Saxon times, and when the prioress of Kirklees held sway in the area, her cut, in the form of corn grown here, over the 250 years that she was in possession of the advowson of Mirfield Church, must have been tremendous, and for all this land, the best in the village, to end as it has done, was a tragedy. Charlie Walker, a corn miller and farmer, was the last man to farm it in one block. If he had lived, the position would have been different. The deaths of Charlie Walker, Dyson Walker and the Mrs. Walker of Holmdene, laid the way open for the state of affairs as we see them today. Chapter 2. As we leave the Wateroyd area and approach the Nab, away down the lane is a fairly busy district. The Walker family occupy Wasp Nest Farm. They keep several horses here to furnish power for the canal-carrying business which they operate. Usually between some coal loading point and Hull they would deliver their outward cargo and then take on a load new to this area, cotton cake for cattle straight from the oil presses at Hull. They were prosperous in the new business and made money. A double row of cottages here were the Wasp Nest itself, sometime occupied by the tenants of long-standing and sometimes by a more migratory type. A bit nearer the bottom of the lane is Widow Row, a row of low-deckers, cosy little houses which the Walker family, John, Willie and George, let for very low rents. I should think that today they would be held in great esteem and would be in great demand. Just a bit further on and we come to another little place, Nab Farm, and just past that a market garden and nursery, Nab Gardens. I can remember going to this place when worked by William Peace. Another thriving business at Wasp's Nest was that of John Lindley, a nail-maker, but there was a darker side to his life. He made pikes for the Luddites, drilled and marched with them and kept alive the movement in the district. He was later taken by the Dunsteeple, as you will later read. He did his time and returned to Wasp Nest and started up his business again. My second sister married his grandson. This John Lindley was taken along with another Mirfield man, called Ben Barker at the Dumb Steeple. One night in November, 1824, they laid waste to two men who were on their way to Leeds. They had wounded them with the pikes that John Lindley had made. Subsequently they died. Lindley and Barker were arrested and tried at Leeds Assizes, but a re-trial was ordered and they were again tried, this time at York. The men who were killed were suspected of being informers against the local Luddites who at that time, 12 years after the Rawfold massacre, were very much underground, although the two arrested men were very active and kept alive the protests against the introduction of the machinery that they thought was to put them out of a job. They were sentenced at York to transportation for 14 years to Van Diemen's Land, now Tasmania. Usually an informer would be taken along with any other suspects to a prearranged rendezvous where, under a threat of death by shooting, they were made to swear on this oath that they would not disclose what they knew, and they would thereafter make anyone that they suspected swear the same oath that they had taken, under the same threats and penalties anywhere, under God's canopy of heaven. A good friend of mine had a distant relative involved in the affair. He was hanged at York. His mother pleaded that she may have her lad's body and bury him properly. For some reason he was not put in a coffin like other men from the Huddersfield area. No, he was left at his mother's house in a sack with the rope still round his neck. His mother had him buried. I had better not tell you where. This area near the Dumb Steeple, Three Nuns and Whitegate, was the stamping ground of the Luddites during the activities in 1812. The field immediately behind the Dumb Steeple was a favourite parade ground and was used on the night of the attack on the Rawfolds. The men concerned commenced to arrive an hour before the off. They had numbers and were formed into squads for different duties. At the off, all were present. Later on their return, it was found that one man was missing. He had jumped over the wall up Brighouse Road, and was away. He was a professional runner, and made it in his way to say good night to the verger at Brighouse as the church clock struck 12 midnight. This alibi enabled him to escape any sentence at a later trial, it being contended by him that it would have been impossible for him to have been a member of the raiding party who had paraded at the Dumb Steeple on the fatal night. His name, I think, was Rayner. As a result of the attack, a lot of men were taken. One on his way back called at the Star at Robert Town. He was badly wounded but soon left the Star. He called at the White Gate, where he died in the doorway. Altogether 17 men were hanged at York in addition to those transported. We will now enter Foxroyd, a lane which was originally away across the moor to the church at Mirfield, later just a farm road and footpath which it now is. It has not altered much over the years, save for the pulling down of the farm buildings and a few cottages which had curious stone mullioned windows. Have you ever heard of a highwayman called Neverson? Well, it is said that at the time of his activities, he did, on occasions, when visiting his local girlfriend at Roydnook, stable his horse here at Foxroyd. You can almost see him now, leaving his girl at Roydnook, cutting across country to emerge behind the old King's Head, crossing the road there and get into Cripplegate, and keeping along the hedge to Foxroyd, into the yard there, give his famous horse a drink and away, up the lane, across the common, and up the slipper and into the moor road proper, to await the Leeds to Manchester coach, and then on his way again. It was perhaps on this very night when he killed the landlord of a public house at Batley. He called at this man's house for a drink. The landlord recognized him, and hoping to reap the reward offered, raised the alarm. But he was too late. Neverson was aware, and was out and mounting his mare when the landlord tried to stop him. He was shot and killed, and Neverson was away again, eventually to be caught at the Three Houses Inn, Sandal, and hanged at York. Away on our left we can see all the land enclosed from the moor, the little farm spots that are still there, the chimney at the leather mill. I like to think of the time when the builder of the mill, George Walker, would walk across John Farrar's nearby enclosed land, from Hartshead where he lived, to view the site for his new venture. He was a brave man and did succeed. He was my wife's grandfather. John Farrar's place faces us when we stop by the gypsy camp and look across the road. It is still a sound place and has witnessed much during its life as the moorlands farm. The comings and goings and the rattling of feet on a morning as the colliers went to their day's slavery at the King's Head pit, or the batty day-ho of the horses and carts trotting over the common to Huddersfield, or perhaps farther over. Stop now and turn around, and look across the valley where Hopton is still asleep, away to the hill beyond, and then, far away, just bursting out of the rising mist, you can see the start of the old pack horse track that runs down to the river at Battyford. Look carefully, and you can see the double row of old trees that bound and mark out the track. If you were a bit nearer, I would show you the paved causeway down which the poor old horses jostled with their loads, usually of cloth from the outlying weavers on the nearby hillsides. They crossed the beck at the bottom, up the hillside by Woodcock Hall, out to the top, and along Chapel Hill, down Hopton Hall Lane, across the road and across the North Moor by a path called now the Iron Stee, and out to Boyf Hall, to join another pack train that came from Kirkheaton and Coburton, and along the old road where the paved track remains, down to the river. If you listen you can hear the bell horse as he gets near the ford, you can hear him when he stops, and the pack master urges him into the water to guide and decoy the train to the other side and up the shelving path to the main road, little more than a track itself, running west to Huddersfield, east to Dewsbury. The velvet weavers' horses leave the train here and scramble up the opposite hillside on their way to Heckmondwike, where their velvet will be sold. The whole of the Hopton hillside remains as it always did. Some of the old family names are still fairly common. The old cockfighters' grandsons and great-grandsons are still here, but I should think no longer cockfighters. When we cross the road across the common, close your eyes, and now, just now, stop and open your eyes again and see before you the panorama that is unequalled in this country. Far away in front see the hills almost to Skipton. Nearer, those purple and gold patches are away to the heights above Queensbury. See the tall chimneys of the Black Dyke Mills of brass band fame. In August time, on a fine day, these purple and golden hills are like a vast carpet laid out before your eyes. Before we leave this area we will have a peep at the remains of Kirklees Priory. The gatehouse now which Robin Hood shot his famous arrow is still intact. The distance from here to his reputed grave is a long way. His bow would take plenty of pulling to get his arrow all that way, but he didn't he? Chapter 3. Just by the gatehouse is the home farm. Behind is the brewhouse, and just a bit further back the imposing Kirklees Hall, the home of the Armitage family since the 1560s. In the yard by the home farm is the site of the former priory of Kirklees, and the cornerstones are still there to see. In an adjoining yard you see the tomb of the prioress of Kirklees, Elizabeth de Stainton, and also the grave of two other nuns. Now you know how the famous inn of which we shall speak later got its name. Around the tomb of Elizabeth runs this inscription: Sweet Jesus of Nazareth, Son of God, take mercy on Elizabeth de Stainton, prioress of this house. You can imagine the peaceful scene here when this was indeed a priory, and the perfect rustic atmosphere is still here. Once inside the gates and you are 1,000 years away and many miles from the humdrum times as we know them now. Look over the trees by Kirklees and not far away, just peeping through the morning mist, the little church at Hartshead. Look carefully and you can see the porch with a beautiful Norman arch overhead. We are told that it was built about 1090. Many famous and infamous heads must have passed under it. We know a few, both sorts. Turn and face the north now, and just in front of you see Roe Head, famous as a school in the time of the Bronte sisters. Their father Patrick Bronte was vicar at Hartshead from 1810 to 1815, and one of his daughters, Maria, was christened there on April the 23rd, 1814. After leaving Hartshead, and when years had passed, and his daughters had grown up, they returned. I believe Charlotte came just as a scholar and stayed to teach, as later did, I think, Emily too. Can you see the little wicket gate out onto the road behind the White Gate Inn? This gate led into the garden at Roe Head and obviated the necessity of leaving or entering by the front door and drive. You can imagine them on a summer's night, walking quietly up the moor, and turning when they got to the top, and looking back across the hills and moors which were to colour all their writings. They would see their famous last home at Howth, or at least the fold in the grim moors that enclose it. It is seldom you can see far over these hills for the almost ever-present mist. They might have walked further up the road towards Birstall, the scene of Shirley, one of the famous Bronte novels. We have nearly passed the famous inn which I just referred to, the Three Nuns. It must be one of the most famous in the country. Its history is steeped with the events of the years, both national and local, and probably dates from the 12th century. At the dissolution of the monasteries by Henry VIII in the year 1538, it was included in land and estates sold by the king. They used a polite phrase to describe this circumstance at the time. They said the king had granted or licensed these monastery sites to different people. In reality, he just plain sold them, amongst them the Three Nuns. Over the years thousands must have called at this famous place. Listen to the Manchester to Leeds coach flying down the moor. Hear the horn, blown to warn them to be ready. Listen to the commotion as the change horses are run out all ready to yoke so that the coach may be away within the minutes allowed. See the maids rushing about, helping the ladies down and guiding them to other places. It being dark and blowing hard, and with little time to spare, the horses are changed. The horn blows for all to be aboard, and they are away again. A yard full of steaming horses and barking dogs, the innkeeper seeing that all is well, and preparations are made for another call later while the cooks are preparing the meals for which it has always been famous. Time passes and the coaches pass into history, but it is still a calling place. Come with me down the moor road and sit on the wall and watch the drovers as they pack their sheep and beasts into the pens, and into the yard across where they draw them, for Leeds, straight up the moor road, and for Wakefield on the lower road. Dogs bark, men shout, beasts low and sheep bleat. Eventually all are sorted out. The local butchers and farmers put theirs in a corner to wait until they have had a drink, perhaps 2 or 3, perhaps more, altogether a busy sight. I can remember this when I was a boy, and have helped in what in retrospect seemed a stirring sight. There were grimmer and sadder sights than this. Listen. Can you hear the shuffle of feet, steady this time and in step? They are the soldiers marching up the moor in the wake of the Luddites. They had marched from Huddersfield. When the landlord closes his door on that dreadful night, he knows that a number of the Luddites have been caught. It's nearly dark now. We will come again in the morning and stop outside the inn and watch the wagon drivers stop by the little bridge over the Nun Brook and lower a bucket to the beck below. When full, pull it up so their tired horses may drink and be refreshed. Ere they start again up the moor, probably to Leeds, a long weary way on a rough road, they plod on, head to tail in an endless procession. These were rough days for both men and beasts. The Industrial Revolution was in full swing, goods had to move fast, and horses and men were cheap. A nearby blacksmith's shop catered for a loose shoe, or a lost shoe, or a shoe like King Richard's horse only required a nail in. Just off the moor road was a thriving wheelwright's, who would fasten on a loose hoop, mend a broken shaft, or if the wagoner was well off, make him a new wagon. This procession would start to alter later in the day, and by 5:30 or 6 p.m. would be in full swing. Tired, steaming horses, men half asleep, they were on their way home to slow it, Marsden, and other towns and villages in Colne Valley. We passed the blacksmith's shop, just below it Nunbrook Farm, an imposing place with a good house that must surely have seen better times. Years ago, a family called Bickers lived here. Besides being farmers, they were joiners and cabinet makers. They took a shop in Mirfield, near to the top of Newgate. It is now a stationer's and printer's shop. Here they founded a business which prospered, and they took it to Dewsbury, where it prospered more. After they left, Josh Buckley took it as a bicycle and furniture shop. He was a good fellow. Before we leave this part of the Moor Road, and just after we pass Nunbrook Farm, see the long garden in front of a double-fronted house. Well, this was once the old Yew Tree Inn. I think one of the last landlords was called Frank Bamforth. He was an old butcher who came from over the mountains. He came from Delft and ended his days in a low-decker at the end of Stocks Bank Road. Look just a bit further up the moor. You can see the old Horseshoe Inn, just a few yards nearer where we stand than the Yew Tree. In its day it was a busy place and a coaching house. You can imagine the bustle and stir as the coach approached, although I do not think it was a horse-changing call. We walk on quietly with the sun on our backs, watch the light trotting horses on their way from Huddersfield to Leeds, and others trotting the opposite way. Prior to railways, before the mail became really efficient, trotting ponies and horses were in great demand, and the 17 miles between the two towns would not be a great obstacle to the good horses of the time. We now approach the Whitegate Inn, at the fork road where the left fork leads to Hartshead village and Roe Head. In the old horse days this area was alive with them, the famous Rangley family having their business here at the inn, and adjoining farm. If you listen you can hear the clip-clop of some tremendous Shire horse as he is being shown on the road, to some prospective buyer, probably a newly prosperous manufacturer from Huddersfield. He must have the best they have. These people were judged on the quality of their horse turnouts, and they were really good to look at. The majority of the horses they sold came from Wales. You can see them now, the man giving a show up and down the road, the buyer being critical. Mr. Rangley himself, standing with a long whip in one hand and a stick in the other, he would stand with arms outstretched and be extolling in a loud voice the virtues of the best we ever owned. The buyer says, "He's too much." "Well, come here, if you alter at all you'll buy him." "All right, I'll give another £1 and that's it." "Come here then, hod up." Mr. Rangley slaps the buyer's hand and the deal is done. "Sold again," goes up the cry, and everybody adjourns to the inn for a drink. Oh, these were happy days, never to come again. I have heard my wife's father talk about playing truant on fair days at Huddersfield. With other big lads, he would ride a horse and lead another. They would leave the Whitegate perhaps with 50 horses. They would sell a few at Deaton Corn Mill, 1 or 2 more before they got to the fair, and what a day they would have. They'd sell up and walk back with the shilling they got for taking 2 horses to the fair. Look straight beyond the Whitegate. You can just see, through the trees, Hartshead Hole. In its day it was a lovely place, marvellous ceilings in the rooms, portraying the seasons of the year. It must have been a wonderful place, and a big area of land was farmed from here. It was farmed for a long time by the Rape family who came, I think, from Pickering. Chapter 4. There was a wonderful carved doorway at the hall, facing Hartshead village, the door jambs and lintel being good examples of the stonemason's art. In fact, almost the whole of the hall portrayed great craftsmanship. It's getting dark now and nearly time to leave the top of this hill. Did you hear the clock strike 11? Just before we go, look again towards Roe Head. You can see the flickering candles as they are carried past the windows as the scholars or teachers make their way to the upper rooms, and into bed. You can imagine the Bronte sisters, after a last look at their pupils, make their last devotions, and then to bed. Slowly all the lights are out and all is quiet. The farm dog at Hartshead Hall barks. It is echoed by the yard dog at Kirklees, and so on down the moor, to the Three Nuns, where a few lights remain in the farm buildings and one in the front room of the inn, but presently these lights are turned out and the night is truly quiet. Midnight has cast her dark cloak over all the countryside. All is quiet now, all is still. It is October 1850, and the darkness thick and impenetrable. Stick close to me as we go back to Waterloyd. We will go over the fields. I know the way. Do not be frightened with what I show you. Can you see the faint red light far across the fields? It's a light in the end cottage in Cripplegate. We are getting nearer now. Do not make a noise. We are nearly there. Come here, and stand close to me. You can see into the house if you stand on your toes. Watch now. Can you see the two women? One moves quietly about. The other nurses a boy of 4 or 5. Surely the angel of death has stroked his fair brow, his pale face and hard-breathing peak of pain and suffering. His mother soothes him, and passes her hand over his fevered brow, and speaks soothingly to him. The other woman comes near to the fire, and places before it a small earthenware bowl. I wonder what she is going to do. Watch now. Can you see she has a bird of some kind in her hand? It is a pigeon. She is cutting its throat. What is this? A few struggles and it is dead. The blood drips slowly into the bowl. She plucks the pigeon quickly, and places the feathers into the now bright fire. She takes the pigeon's heart, and puts a steel pin through it, and places this on the feathers, and pours the blood onto the fire too. The poor boy suddenly stretches out and screams. The women try to comfort him. Suddenly we hear a dog howl in the King's Head yard, and draw away from the window to see what makes him bark. Look carefully. Can you see someone getting over the wall by the graveyard? Yes, it is the local witch. She has come over the field in front of the murder house, through the graveyard and over the wall. She is coming towards us now, a tall gaunt figure covered in black. The clock is starting to strike 12. She quickens her pace, and ere the clock has finished striking midnight, she is striking hard on the door of the cottage, and shrieking to be admitted. We see the door open, and in the chink of light, through the open door, we see her fall on her knees before the women, and hear her beg to be forgiven. They reply they cannot, but she touches the boy. He seems to wake up. Look round. He looks better and smiles. The witch strokes his face and rubs his hands. He gets off his mother's knee, and quietly tries to walk a few paces. Next day, he is better still, and ere a week has passed, he is well again. The spell of the other good witch had prevailed. The bad one said later that she would do it no more. Some day when you get a bit older, I will tell you who these women were. They have relatives still about, and you know them. Tomorrow morning, as soon as it is light, we will go to the top of the slipper again. There is just one other thing for you to see. Come on now, it's daylight, and a lovely morning. We will go over the land at London Park, and stop when we get to the top. Look round now. Can you see across the valley to Hopton? Just waking up. Whiffs of smoke rise slowly as fires are newly lit, and the mist is slowly giving way to the sun. Look across to Whitley Hall. The tower stands like a sentinel bathed with the brilliant first light. Turn round and you can just see Hartshead Church, still struggling to shake off its misty shroud. Look the other way and far away to the west. You can just see the tops of the dark moorlands as they peep through the fog that still fills their dark valleys, and where it will remain for a long time yet. Listen. Can you hear the commotion further over towards the top of the moor road? It's the coach coming up towards the fountain from Leeds. Can you hear the horn blowing? Hurry up, we will perhaps see them, if we get a bit higher up the field. Yes, look. They are just drawing on to the front. They have 6 horses, they are sweating, and blowing hard. It's a long hard 11 miles from Leeds, and not too good a road. The passengers are getting down, the horses are loosed out, the change horses are being run out, all ready to just yoke up. The wheel horses are already made fast, the pin horses next, and last the pair of grey lead horses. The coachman is talking to the landlord, and suddenly the horn blows. All aboard again. Sparks fly as the impatient horses pull away, over the hard-setted yard, and they are down the moor road. Watch as they pass us. What a sight! The horses fit and fresh. The coachman has them all well in hand. They are going at a rare rate. The passengers outside all look content and happy. The sun is shining on them, and another half hour they will be having breakfast at the Pack Horse, in Huddersfield. Chapter 5. Tomorrow be ready, in good time, and we will go to as yet unexplored country, Houghton. Or as the older people say, Hovert River. Or Hovert Water. Well, are you ready? I see you are. So down Knoll Road, and Dr. Lane, the big houses that you see in the process of being built, are the first of the long series that seems to go on forever. Down between the fields on both sides of Sharp Lane, we are near the bottom now, the old low-deckers at the bottom, and in front of the newly built Kingsgrove Park. Across the road, another one between the Huddersfield Road and the river, a beautiful sight. On the other side of the road, and near what is now called the Railway Inn, a busy place, the tailor's shop, operated by Stockshurst. He usually employed 9 or 10 journeyman tailors, and his clothes were the best. A lot of his trade was the making of clothes for the gamekeepers, bailiffs, etc., of the newly rich of the area, in the newly efficient cloth trade. It would never do for the Lord of the Rings to invite his pals, who were similar to himself, for a day's shooting, and for his gamekeeper to appear with his breeches arse out. So he forestalled this threat by providing him with a good suit that would also enhance his own paternalistic image. The keeper got his suit, and his boss's prestige as a father figure was assured, and everybody was happy, or nearly anyway. Incidentally, I think that this suit business could operate today with good effect. Sometimes if you have time to watch the racing on television, and in the pre-race parade you will be told how much this colt cost. 10,000 guineas perhaps. The lad who is leading him round looks as if he got his clothes from a 1900 nearly new shop. However, we will get on with our exploring. The council offices are a cloth shop, owned by a fellow called Barker. There are a set of farm buildings behind, from which a big area of land was farmed, including the now St. Paul's Road area. Once, when I was a little lad, I saw a drove of horses that had been doubling cab horses. They had walked over Standage, from Liverpool, on the way to Lee Gap. Harry King bought one, a dun horse, for £3 10s, and worked him for years in his father's hay and straw carrying business, which he started when he ceased to be bailiff. At the Three Nuns, he operated this business in the Black Bull Yard, near Amsden's butcher's shop, for a long period. Before we get there, though, we pass the post office, Jeffrey's printers, and Mackenhall's tinkers, and tinsmiths. We next encounter Road chemist shop. Here they did everything you were likely to require. They would pull you a tooth, poison your dog, make your hair grow, whether it would or not, cure your bad cold and toothache, cure your poorly horse or cow, in fact, anything. My father did a lot of horse and cow doctoring at this time, and old Mr. Joe Rhodes was in league with him. They had an old greasy bottle, filled with some concoction that my father called the kicking mare bottle. It would quieten anything, including fractious kids at bedtime. It would. At the corner, where the bank now is, we had Slater's tea stores, where the windows facing the Black Bull were full of the prizes you would get. if you only bought enough tea. Across the road, at the top of what is now Station Road, we had the Lion stores, always with millions of eggs outside in boxes packed with straw and shavings. Lads used to say they were snake eggs, but they had to eat them just the same, usually about 36 for a shilling. Adjoining the Lion stores was a boot shop, old Mr. Gauls. He sold the best boots in town. Rawnsley's had also a good boot shop near Rhodes' chemist shop. I nearly forgot, I once went to Rhodes one Sunday dinner time, and yes, it was still dinner time in Mirfield at 12:30. People had not become so fancy that they had lunch at that time. For a tooth pulling, he nearly pulled my head off with a pair of pliers, and then said I'd better go to a dentist. Why my mother sent me on this trip alone I never knew. I had 10 brothers and sisters. Anyway, although he did not pull the tooth, it never ached again. 100 years ago, Henry Linus Cook started his fruit and green grocery business down Station Road. The newly built station in 1865 attracted people in great numbers. It was unusual not to see a crowd back to the kiln wall on a Saturday night. Oranges would be 24 for a shilling, and fruit in season would be a few pence for a basket. A bit higher up the road, another shop, Sam Willie Holt's fish shop, Mrs. Thornton's next door, toys and sweets, altogether a very busy road. On the other side of the road Crowther's new kiln. The biggest industry then in Mirfield was malting. The aroma of roasting malt would pervade the area for usually a few days a week. At Mirfield feast time, a row of stalls stretched from the Black Bull to Parker Lane, and every house was open house. Lumps of beef, legs of mutton. The set pot was put on for plum puddings. It was really the feast week. I don't think anybody would get seriously into debt for this. Most people were family providers, and food was cheap. On the Sunday, there was a concert in the feast ground, music provided by the feast organ, and then a fashion parade in the cricket field, all the girls, in their new frocks and hats. We will go down the new gate now. It is literally the new gate. The canal was cut in the year 1776. This area at this time must have been a very pretty place. No railway yet, and in front of the corn mill, a small grass croft. It was called the Croft. This corn mill was a very much used and important place. Hopton Old Bridge, that is Ledge Hard Bridge, was built chiefly so that farmers, etc., could get over the river to have their corn ground, and to provide a crossing for people who had left the stagecoach at the blacksmith's at the top of Kirkheaton Moor. They then had to walk down Hopton Lane to the North Gate, turn right along a much-worn field path, and over the Iron Stee, down the Nursery and Chadwick Lane, to come out at the Hopton end of the bridge. They could now cross the river, and go up Newgate, and into East Thorpe Lane. The river would be much lower than it is now. After the canal was cut, and the weir built, it would be higher by a few feet, and provided the power for the corn mill, built 1674. Incidentally, they were the owners of the water rights at this mill for a long time. The proprietors at this time was John Pilling. Across the road, and off Newgate, a kiln was built to deal with barley for malting, that could now come by canal. To the right of this kiln, and standing in a lovely garden, was a big stone house, and farm buildings. It was a lovely house, but it fell on evil times and finished up as part of a foundry after being a boarding house. Behind the kiln, and nearer to Station Road, a boat building business was started, and flourished for a long time. It provided boats for all Mirfield boating families: Schofields, Websters, Cloughs, Walkers, Ledge Hards, Barkers, Fields, Normontons, Wilsons, Burns, and Dutons. There are probably more, I forget. The first railway station was built, I believe, in 1847, and was at the bottom of Newgate, just before you cross the river. I have read an article on its opening. It was a grand affair, and special reference to the mill is made, and the view presented when passing, in the newfangled railway truck, so we have some idea of the importance attached to a corn mill at this time. Flour would be largely home-produced, and all animal feed that required preparation would be the product of the local mill, although at this time very little in the form of bought meal was used on the farm. Turnips had just become popular and, along with the homegrown corn, provided most of the farm's requirements. Chapter 6. Look over the river, and you will see an outstanding example of the dark satanic mills we have often read about. Here is one in full blast. If the devil himself jumped into the river by the ship inn, and paddled the length of the Calder to Hebden Bridge, he would come to the conclusion that he was good to his tenants, the accommodation he furnished far more pleasant than the majority of the holes he passed, for which people were imprisoned for anything up to 14 hours a day. His place would traditionally be a bit warmer, but that apart, there would not be much in them. And now, 100 years later, they have not improved much, in outward appearance at least. The benevolent family who first started them departed the area decades ago to pleasanter climes, where they would not be reminded where and how they got it all. These deadly holes must be far away from their everyday thoughts. Mills were not the only terrible places in which to earn your daily bread. The area was honeycombed with day holes. Small local collieries usually cut at an angle into the hillside, where coal was known to lie. There were a few in the Cuckoo Hill district. One at the bottom of Dransfield Hill, and also here a row of cottages to house some of the pit workers. One family I knew when I was younger did not do very well, in spite of the fact that everybody was roped in to work. They lived by the flower pot. Their youngest child was a little girl aged 5. At that time she said she was too tired to walk all that way, Daddy, so he carried her to her work, where she worked, with a rope tied round her tummy, and she pulled buckets filled with coal, out to the daylight. She did this from daylight to dark, most days. Have I to tell you her name? Well, I won't just now. I'll bet you know her grandson. The more efficient pits in the area would be rather better places to work in, but people had to work long and hard for very little, and in terrible conditions. Many times, I have seen men leave the old King's Head pit, and should they stop on their way, they would leave the pond where they had been stood. They were wet through. Should they get across the Boss, their chance of getting work of any kind was slender. I heard of a man, when I was a boy, to whom the proprietor of a pit took a dislike, and sacked him. He could not get a job anywhere for a long time. Then he got a labouring job during some alterations at a church, but the parson saw him and said he would be back in an hour, and he had to get off the church premises by then, and so he did. So he starved a bit harder, and a bit longer. You know this fellow, don't you? You don't? Well, if you call at a local hostelry tonight, he will buy you a drop of whiskey. But it wasn't all gloom. If you could make do with little, there was abundance. The sun shone, the birds sang, the grass grew, and the trees burst into leaf. Regattas at the Battyford Sands, rowing matches at the Ship Inn, running races on the riverside, horse trots, tenant Sarahs and back. A local butcher with trot in him, and black or white, in daylight or dark, rain or shine, snow or hail, thunderstorms or in a fair wind, with his trotting pony Red Apple. He'd trot for £1,000 or drinks all round at the Savile Arms. He wasn't fussy. Donkey and cart races were held on East Thorpe Lane. The drivers had to have black faces. This encouraged the donkeys to further effort. A later and rougher pastime of 50 years ago was swimming round the navigation yard, newly covered with cinders. Cockfighting had long been a popular pastime in the area. Some of the old cockfighting families are still around, although I do not think they do any now. It was a highly organized business, and not the haphazard affair folks usually think. I suppose there is a certain amount of cruelty involved, but there was plenty too when you got your backside cracked too often. The birds were strictly handicapped according to weight, and all the mains, as they were called, were run very fairly. I have painted 2 cocks, which I knew very well. One fought a few times at the huge place of a titled fellow. He was a good chap too, but his cocks were no match for the duck wing. My grandmother kept a few fighting cocks, not my granddad. She had all the bits and pieces relating to the business. She had a little tin shovel, about 4-inch square, with sides on. This she would fill with corn, previously steeped in a drop of whiskey, shake it over the fire a minute to toast, and dry all the excess moisture from it. If a cock got this in his crop the night before, it would make him fight, whether he wanted to or not. When I was a little lad, hanging over my mother's mantelpiece was a pair of spurs worn by some of my distant uncles, to encourage a doubtful horse to go a bit faster. Inside each spur was the breastbone of some famous cock, who had ended his days in the pot. One day a parson from the parish church called to see my ma. She said he always called at tea time. He usually inspected the horsey gallery of photos my mother would tell about, the latest edition, why he hadn't won when he should have done, and why the jockey tumbled off, because he was drunk. This day, he was keen to know about the spurs and the fighting cock's breastbones. He asked if these were some smaller spurs that her lads had been making. My mother did not tell stories, but I believe that on this occasion, in order to safeguard our collective journey to another place, in the faraway future, a journey that her parson friend could veto in the event of an unsatisfactory answer, she just smiled, and the parson smiled too. His name was McWatters. He was a curate, and perhaps being just a curate would prevent him from having all the powers he would later possess. This was before the time of Mr. Khrushchev and his friends. Had my mother's visitor been other than the parson, she would have acclaimed the origin of the spurs and lucky bones from the fighting cocks with some relish. They were part of the family's traditional connection with hunting, cockfighting, horse dealing, dog running, in fact all the sports and pastimes of a bygone age, some now frowned upon, compared with things that have happened since in the name of sport. Why, these old sports were as bright and fresh as a primrose on Easter Day. A German soldier would later try to kill me one Easter Day. It is recorded that Charles II gave Nelguin a pair of silver cock spurs. He also had a master of cockfighting, and Sir George Vernon of Madden Hall received £2 from the household purse every time he went to a cockfight, so it was truly one of the royal sports. I should think that my grandmother would think nothing wrong of the fighting involved. The menfolk in her family have fought for everything, including fighting Cromwell in the civil wars. A Captain James Schofield commanded the royalist forces charged with the defence of Bolton. In the process he was skinned financially, and was as poor as a crow, he said. Since then, they have worn black eyes over a lovely girl, a doubtful horse, a screw cow, and many times on cocking days. My eldest brother told me of going to a main between Yorkshire and Lancashire, in the narrow ride near Toppet's Top. He said he never thought there were as many golden sovereigns as he saw that day. Another cockpit was near Boyf Hall, with one nearer to Cone Bridge, and Yetton was the home of the cockers. All in all, I suppose that cockfighting in its day would occupy a place in the social life of a village on a par with the present-day cricket or football team. My grandmother's family, the Schofields, she was my father's mother, were hafted in the Stanage area. They have been so since the 1500s, an area where parsons and bobbies did not abound, and the Wild Moor Edge was the venue for all the old sports. Hunting days were nearly every day. In its turn the wild moorcock would be coaxed and beaten from its heather bed, on the few days it could be so treated. There is a lot of hypocrisy regarding the so-called blood sports. A woman blasted me not many weeks ago about the horse trade and the final destiny of a lot of these animals. She wore a sheepskin coat, had leather shoes, a feather in her hat, and was in a butcher's shop. She was buying chops, steak and liver. When I asked her what she thought these poor so-and-sos thought of the job, she seemed surprised, but told me that all these things were the source of the protein she required, including I suppose the old tup's coat she wore. I detest cruelty of any kind, and so do most of my friends. Poaching was a popular pastime too, both for the pot, for fun, and to beat the keepers. It was usually a family tradition. Well-known local families would indulge, and were prepared to take on all comers, which they did many times. I remember once, a gang had been caught in the local wood, and the keepers and one policeman took them to the big house, and ushered them into the drawing room, and behold, the big man's son, and a well-known local butcher. They were all good fellows, and kept law and order themselves. One morning, very early, a fellow I knew well had to go up the Toppets to his work at Lepton. This morning, a family and friends were netting the wall from the middle gate to the bottom, and a good job they made. They had dozens of rabbits fast in the net, and as my friend approached he was saluted with a cheery "How do?" But much to his surprise, he was shanghaied, and set to work. He was aboard the Bounty, all right, and for once Captain Bligh and Fletcher Christian were good pals. Everybody worked for the next half hour. All the rabbits were gutted and put in sacks. Other fellows were taking a net in that had been set on pegs for hares, or used as a draw net for partridge. They had 6 hares, and 2 partridges, a good night's work. They had parked an old van in a yard that they passed. They would pay the farmer a toll, in the shape of game, and everybody was happy. Our friend prepared to leave his fellow crew members, but they said, "Do not be so sharp. You had better ride back part way with us." Dick protested, and said he would be deaf and dumb as far as the hare was concerned, but he had to go, and finished up walking back from this side of Barnsley. He was no flady cat. Before this book is done, you will have an account of an escapade of his that will both surprise and shock you, and it will all be true. Directly facing you, when you cross the old bridge at Hopton, the Ledge-Hard Bridge of 1800, there is what was formerly called the coal yard. It was in fact at one time a coal yard, and was an area that provided the exit for a day hold that operated under the land above the waste. An old Hopton fellow, Harry Oldroyd, used to tell me about riding back into the pit to an engine house, properly built, with winding machinery installed, situated under the co-op field. Do you remember, where we used to sit on a steep bank, to listen to Punch and Judy on the old co-op days? Well, it was lower down the field and nearer to the nursery plantation. At the exit end in the coal yard, a scoot track started and ran on the roadside in front of the pub, alongside Butt End Mill Yard, to a coal staith just above the newly built weir, or dam stake as we call it. Here scoops were tipped into boats waiting to take coal further up the canal, to the new mills that had lately started. Tom Taylor, another Hopton fellow, who would now be 150 if living, told me that he could remember a wooden bridge at this point, before the Iron Horse Bridge was built. Both are, of course, now demolished. After this pit ceased to operate, a mineral water factory was built. It was a busy place, and would keep 8 or 10 horses busy with deliveries. Also, a coal business still continued to function, but now in bags, or loads, no longer boat loads. About this time, a smallpox epidemic raged in the area. There were several cases in Mirfield, a few in Hopton. I think the Hopton cases were nearly all in one family. The feeding and general looking after of this family was undertaken by the new proprietor of the mineral water factory, Charlie Appleyard. He was a brave fellow, and saw at the end of the epidemic that the family had survived. Just before this factory started, and when the pit had ceased to work, a travelling theatre would call a few times a year. It was operated by a family called Rhodes. They all took part in the presentation of different plays, and would sometimes lapse into the local lingo. One night, during the acting of a Shakespeare play, a fellow rushed on stage to announce that the Duke has gotten lamed. "By gum, not so badly, I wop," replied the prince. Everybody laughed, but everybody understood. Money was tight in the area. Overt water Hopton letters depended largely on the textile industry, now being carried on in the newly built mills, and no longer a cottage industry, as it had been until now. A large number of people worked on the river, coal carrying by barge, from lower down the Calder to Huddersfield, Brighouse, Elland and Sowerby Bridge. Flour mills had been built at Elland, Brighouse and Sowerby Bridge, and a brisk trade was done by the boating families at Hopton. Anyone called Schofield at the time was engaged in this trade. Their boats were built near the canal behind the Navigation Pub. A family called Thornton operated the yard for a long time. It was fantastic to see the vessel that the local fellows built. Launching day was a big event. A big dinner and a booze up at the Navy, kept for a long time by the Blackburn family. One of the very last craftsmen employed here was a fellow called Willie Heenel, a superman in the art. The boat he built is still afloat and bears his name. Hopton, generally at this time, was just being built to house the textile operatives and men employed at the newly built engine sheds. A new race emerged, drivers. They were the elite. They lived on driver's steak, sucked whiskey, had the best of clothes, and in every way were a cut apart. They were all good fellows, and brought their families up to be good people. Yes, they were good fellows, but people at the other end of the railway labour roster were a long way behind. At the time of which I write, the labouring chap got 17 shillings and 10 pence a week. Textile wages were low, conditions harsh, hours long. An old woman in Hopton told me about her husband being laid off for 6 weeks. They lived on the wage he had drawn that week prior to being sent home, 16 shillings and 2 pence. They lived on potatoes and ducks from the butcher at 1 shilling and 2 pence each. Another old lady I knew well lived at Whitley when she was a girl. One morning, she awoke at 4 o'clock to see a foot of snow. She got up, got dressed, and set off to walk down the long lanes through Hag Wood, down the lane and into Hopton. Instead of being at her job at 6 o'clock, it was nearly 7. She was locked out and had to wait until 9 o'clock to be let in. For being late she was fined 4 shilling and 6 pence, another 1 shilling and 6 pence, for being fined. And instead of the 6 shillings she should have had for a full week, she worked all week for nothing. But people managed to laugh and have their fun. A gala at Hopton Mills, a firework display, all the cracks were there, and cricketers, George Herbert Hurst, Wilfred Rhodes, Schofield Hague. Beer was 2 pence a pint, best steak 1 shilling a pound, mutton chops 10 pence, and eggs usually 24 for 1 shilling. Ned Wilson would make you a good suit for £2, and if you wanted a bit of horse trading, he would do you a bit of a swap. Chapter 7. The boating trade attracted a lot of men not of the Hopton Schofield tribe, and the condition which prevailed in these lesser firms were not always good. Our picture portrays a fairly common circumstance. The boat in question belonged to a Dewsbury firm. They would provide 15 shillings to hire a horse to pull the boat to Sowerby Bridge, laden with wheat, the horse to be left there. Evidently a system worked whereby horses would be available on the bank for the return journey, if wanted and the boat are able to pay. In the instance we are looking at, this boat tied up by the Bull Bridge, and the woman on the boat as part working crew, made her way to her mother's house not far from the Black Bull. She sought her younger brother, a boy of 12, he was to go with her, and her husband to Sowerby Bridge aboard their boat, sleep aboard that night, and be the boat steerer downstream back to Mirfield. They had a drink of tea which their mother made, and then joined the boat, and set off on the long haul to Sowerby Bridge. It was late summer, but they hoped with luck to get there before dark. They were lucky and managed to do so. Jack, the husband, handed the horse over to a new hirer, near the flour mill to which they were going. Men worked most of the night, and got the boat unloaded, and at first light the following morning, they were up drinking tea, but our young lad, now the boat steerer, was still asleep. His sister shouted for him to come up on deck. It was time to be framing. A long haul back to the Bull Bridge awaited them. He had a drink of tea, nothing to eat, and then his sister jumped ashore, followed by Jack, who carried a bundle of straps and ropes. He proceeded to sort them out, and finally Sarah was ready to be yoked up like a donkey. Yes, she had a set of harness on. Jack arrayed himself in another set, and fastened a ring in Sarah's harness, to a long line attached to the post on the boat, used for this purpose. Young Dick was so stricken with remorse, when he saw his sister yoked up as she was, that he jumped ashore, clung to her and said he would be the donkey, and her to be boat steerer. A long discussion took place, and finally this happened. At tea time they were tied up again at the Bull Bridge in Mirfield. They went to Sarah's mother's house and had a fair tea. Young Dick said his shoulder was sore and he was tired too. He had saved his sister the humiliation of being treated as an animal, and also the hard physical work that would have been entailed. I knew a man connected with the family responsible for this exercise. In fact, he was well known, not a member of any of the Mirfield boating tribe, and wherever he is now, whether in heaven or the other place, I hope he's yoked with a bad donkey, to a boat that always scrapes the bottom anyway. Sarah survived and lived to be an old woman. Young Dick is still about. I saw him yesterday. He must be nearly 100 years old. So much for the bad boaters. The Bull Bridge, to which I refer, is of course still near Cook's old shop up Station Road. The house adjoining the bridge was formerly a pub, the Jolly Sailor, I think, and a butcher's shop. It was also the rendezvous of smugglers. The door they used is still there, and still opens onto the canal, with ease of access for boats from the coast. A relation of mine used to tell me about this. Spirits were usually the smugglers' target, and it was a fairly easy business to get them from Hull via the canal to Mirfield, although this business was fairly well tied up by just a few families. You can visualize some barge captain drawing fairly near to the old pub's cellar door. It would quickly open, receive the spoil, shut again, the horse now across the bridge, and scrambling down the steep bank on the other side, the line hooked on, and they were away again, perhaps a few pounds richer for the escapade, the captain wondering if the marine, that is the man on the bank, had twigged it. If he had, he would want his cut. The butcher's shop, I think, did quite well, fitting the canal people with their requirements. At this period, it was the only shop on the bank, after leaving Shepley Bridge. I can remember a chap called King having the butcher's shop, not Harry King, when I was just a small lad. So much for the Bull Bridge. Before we walk further along Hopton, we will walk up Chadwick Fold, towards the old Chadwick Hall, a marvellous old place, but fallen on evil times, now farm buildings. Years ago, it was inhabited by human beings at least. What tales its narrow passages could unfold, its mullioned windows tell of the stirring scenes, perhaps little episodes of the '45 rebellion, Later stories of the canal being dug, of mills being built, of the moor, just a bit higher up the hill being enclosed. We will walk as far up the lane, at the Iron Stee, turn and look towards Combe Bridge, and Upper Heaton, across the North Moor. Today it is indeed the North Moor of legend. A bitter north wind rakes the hillside. Every living thing turns its back towards it, hangs its head and waits for it to pass, but it is an area that has suffered north winds before, had its face raked, and plundered by both man, beast and nature. Now it endures the worst of all, the Enclosure Acts. Prior to the enactment of these dastardly bills, the little man could live on his few acres. He kept a cow, or two, a pig, a few hens, if he was well off, a pony too. Times would be hard, and the north wind would blow. But he was independent. He did not touch his cap to any man. His wife would weave him cloth for a coat, spin his wool from his few sheep. All he requested was his salt pot to be kept full, and a pack of flour now and then. His crown and glory, or so he thought, was his little place. It had been his father's, and his father's before him. Aye, it was his all right. But one fine morning, a man came with papers. He said the place was now his. They had papers to prove it. "Read this," the man said, but he could not read, he could not write, and did not understand the papers. He listened a long time and then said, it was still his. He did not care what any man said, and he would shoot the first man to enter his place, but he was too late. The other man was agent to some wealthy person who had access to maps, could read the orders relating to the new acts. Our little man, and his father before, had held his place without papers, and also more important, without question. Now it was over. If he wanted, he could become the tenant of the man with the papers. Now a new problem arose. He required money to pay his new landlord his rent, or without the money, to get off. This was usually the case. All this coincided with the Industrial Revolution. The new factories required workpeople in their thousands. So the hitherto independent small farmer, with common rights which his family had enjoyed for generations, had to leave the hillsides, to take up a job and to live in the ghettos, already being provided for him. When you walk on Hopton again, just look up the narrow streets, and find out when and why they were built. He must eat at least once a day. Without money he could not do this. The new mills were the answer. The whole family would become engulfed in the pursuit of cash for bread. Children, 4 or 5 years old, old men and women, in fact everybody. It was said at the time that 75% of the people of the Yorkshire Dales had left as the result of the operation of these acts, the majority of them called Metcalfe, and living in Bradford. The church was one of the chief villains in this sordid exercise, and enclosed thousands of acres, whole hillsides being enclosed by them, and some local upstart manufacturers, who had the cash for the legal formalities, and a tame agent to carry them out. Large areas were enclosed by titled people. As distinct from the machination of the Enclosure Acts, there are huge areas of land occupied by people, or let to people. They say are tenants, who at best have a very shaky title to them. I know one family who have held a farm for above 600 years, another man who says he is the owner of 14,000 acres of land including their farm, which they have maintained in good fettle all this long period. I should think the production of a full and legal title would be required some effort. I know another family on the east coast who were turfed off their place at the dissolution of the monasteries and have since been landless, but on open or fair days, they go to the old place for a look round. However, they are always very well dressed, can run a car, and generally entertain you in a manner to which they are accustomed. In the process of their evacuation, I think they salvaged plenty cash, but their grandpa was hung, drawn and quartered, and to make everybody alike, he was cut up, and all his pals and relatives got a bit. Incidentally, the path we are on now, that is up the nursery side, marks the western boundary of the enclosed land. To the east of this lane, and running back to Penistone, lies the Beaumont estate, an estate which takes in practically all the land with which we are familiar. We have already mentioned one old hall, Chadwick Hall. Another two further east of here, one at Waste. This was a wonderful stone building, marvellous mullioned windows, a Hugs Hall which was the entrance, a stone bench ran the whole way round providing a seat. The windows looked down on Hopton. It must have surveyed a wonderful scene in the old days, and been the centre of a big farming area. Some equally old farm buildings are found across the rough road from this house. I never came across anybody to whom the history of the place was familiar. Another old house, which I should think has over the years enjoyed fame, having been regarded as the birthplace of the famous John de Hopton, Bishop of Norwich, and the Kingmaker. I refer, of course, to an old house situated up Hand Bank, lately renovated. I think that at its name of the early days, Black Hall is largely the principal cause of its claim to fame. I should think that it is unlikely that any important family, as the Hoptons were, would be likely to live here. The house itself is a very ordinary one, being built at the period when scaffolding was not used. A gradual slope to the roof started fairly near to the ground level, provided the means of access to the apex of the roof, and higher parts of the walls. In addition, it is a sandstone building, very little dressed stone is used, and the stone required was probably quarried at an adjoining quarry, or indeed on the land on which it is built. Now, as the result of improvements, it is a wonderful place, but the basics of the place are not altered. No, I would be surprised if the de Hopton family lived here. When I was a little lad it was a farmhouse. One lovely summer's day, along with some more lads and lasses, we visited the place, on a bird nesting expedition. In the process, one of the girls fell down the well. After a big hullabaloo, she was rescued, and her auntie, who lived nearby, gave her a good hiding for falling down. No kissing you better in those days. Poor lass, she did plenty falling after this day, and not just down a well. Further up the hill is an example of building with handmade bricks. A whole series of farm buildings and a lovely house are as good today as the day the bricks were burned. In a largely inaccessible area, this would be the best material to use. It did not require carting, it was on site and was used extensively in Hopton. At one period, a fantastic suggestion was put forward to the effect that the de Hopton family did actually live at Black Hall in Mirfield, but another Black Hall was dug up, Blake Hall being now the fashionable domicile of the illustrious family. But seeing that the bishop had left his see about 600 years before Blake Hall was built, the two items take some reconciling. If you look east from where you are now, you will see just peeping its chimneys through the trees, the old New Hall, now a farmhouse. When first built it was a place of some importance. Although a farmhouse, its position commanded a view of most of the land farmed from there. The Beaumonts left, and afterwards, it became tenanted, usually by a good type of farmer, although its worst tenants were two firms and not individuals. Between them, they were responsible for its gradual decline. One of its best tenants was a man called Ed Hartley. We are now viewing from Hand Bank some of the most glorious scenery in Yorkshire. Let's walk down the bank. We are now in Hopton Lane, near the flower pot. We will turn through a snicket, by the old handloom weaver's house. The path will take us over the Cuckoo Hill, but just look at this old house, now just up and made quite modern. 100 years ago this was a busy corner. Two brothers, Henry and David Oxley, were handloom weavers. Imagine the scene. Up the outside steps would go all the yarn, probably hand-spun from a neighbouring farmer's sheep, all the wet from the same source. A long and busy weekday, probably the same every day. The finished piece would be put on a pack horse and taken to Huddersfield, there to be sold. This activity was the base of the economy in the area, plus of course, the farming, which dominated the whole life just here. In fact, when you look around, I think you find it still does, although the number of people employed in farming is very tiny, when compared with the pre-machine age, and when every little job was hand-done. If we proceed along this path, we shall pass what is now a very elaborate farmhouse and buildings. Formerly it was the site of a pit, the buzzer pit to be exact. It did not operate for long. I think that the water encountered made it a very unprofitable proposition. During its lifetime the coal obtained was run via a scoot track across the fields, and into Granny Lane, across the road and to a coal staith almost opposite the mill on the other side of the river. Here boats tied up and were filled. This would be about the limit to which a broad boat could travel upriver, although occasionally I have seen a horse-drawn barge dredging for sand, tied up behind the flower pot, on the top side of the new bridge. After its demise as a pit, it soon became a farm, and believe it or not, the site of the first depot for Silcock's cattle cake. In fact, at the time I think it was the only one, too. Johnny Rychin was the agent. He combined his agency with the boss's job at the mill at Woodbottom. I used to take his dinner for him on my way home from school. His daughter used to give me a halfpenny, and tell me to run all the way to keep the pudding warm, and as I went over the Cuckoo Hill, it was quite a feat. More times than not, though, the pudding would be cold. Tom Kitson had his leg cut off at this pit. Can you remember him? He became a milkman through another stee hole, and now we are on the wood side at Gregory Spring. Across the fields on our left the harvest in full swing, 2 horses in a reaper and 2 men sitting on the machine. Not a self-binder yet. One man is the horseman, the other sits just a bit further back, and with his foot operates a gate that holds up the cut corn until enough for a sheaf has been cut. Then the gate is released, and with a rake, the head not set at an angle to the shaft, he pushes off the new sheaf. Round the field we go until a complete round has been cut. Then the men dismount, and with other helpers proceed to tie up the corn, all by hand with handmade bands. Eventually all is cut and tied up. Then the sheaves are collected and set up in kivers of 10 facing usually in an east-west direction, so that only the outside sheaf would catch the prevailing west wind. You thought they were set up anyway, didn't you? Well, they're gone not, you see. Further uphill and a few fields away, what must be the most beautifully situated house in Mirfield, Woodcock Hole. This hall merits anything the agents could say about it. Every morning when the owners arise, they must think they are in heaven. I have never anywhere seen a more lovely place. It used to be the home of the Whitehead family, who farmed it for a long time. I bought my first bike at the farm sale here when the Whitehead family left. Joe Parkinson of Mirfield was the auctioneer. He'd sold a lot of the stock, and when he got to the bike, Margaret Yard called, "Let's have a go, Joe." So have a go. He did, and I bought the bike for 10 shillings. Everything is very quiet here, not a sound save perhaps a partridge calling, a lark singing. If you watch you will see a rabbit scurry along the dry and dusty path to its burrow in yon hedge bottom, over the field at the top and out into the bridle path. Now again the most beautiful scene, the Whitley and Lyle Leywood facing you, Woodbottom hamlet, and the cricket field in the bottom. Years ago the venue for the class cricket matches, and a delightful setting just like you see on the pictures, down the bridle path and along Springwood Bottom. Now here is heaven. Walk on this wood side on a September morning, with the sun just breaking through the tall trees opposite. Every drop of dew becomes a diamond, the humblest bracken frond a bejeweled necklace, the little beck a splash of quicksilver as it gurgles under a single stone, and before it falls with a tiny roar to the underground way, which eventually takes it to the Calder. Listen, did you hear that? It was a fox barking. a vixen calling for her cubs or perhaps her mate. There are quite a few about here. Watch that cock pheasant tread daintily across the path. He's going to dust in the gateway. That's a hen following him. Keep still, and we shall see the remainder of his harem. Ah, here they come, another 3 of them. They're young now, old enough to take care of themselves. Let's go now. We can see this scene nearly any day here, but it's ever new, and ever delightful. I once heard my father say that he didn't think heaven would be any nicer than here. He was right. From Lisle Lane and down the Toppets, the Dransfields would pass on their way to the church at Mirfield. They were the big pots in the area, prior to the arrival on the scene of the Beaumonts. If you look carefully nearer the Lisle Lane end of the Toppets, you see evidence that this path was fairly important, and was maintained as one that was used fairly extensively. A drainage system was a part of the scheme. This would be prior to wheel traffic, of course, and would be for the benefit of people on horseback. They would pass down the Toppets, up the bridle path, down Newhall Hill, down the boathouse lane, to the ferry at the bottom and across to the church. Chapter 8. The boathouse at this time would be indeed the boathouse, a ferry operated from the lane end to the far bank of the river, although there is not much evidence of this now. Any that remained until the construction of the new road would, I suppose, disappear at the time. An alternative route to this point, from the Lisle Lane area, would be down Dransfield Hill, called, I presume, after the famous family. This, I think, would also be a bridle path, although if you rode a horse over it during my time, it was only at the goodwill of the tenant farmer. A pack horse track did operate over a good part of it all the same. The Waddington family were the owners of the boathouse estate for a long time. How long I do not know. The family seat was Broadoaks, a marvellous old house complete with a set of farm buildings. It still is a wonderful place, now with the occupation of someone else. The Waddingtons belonged also to a large area of land and woods, including Hagwood. The land on both sides of Hagwood Lane belonged to them, and in a building at the bottom of Hagwood Lane, they, along I think with some people called Cardwell, installed the first steam engine to drive machinery in Hopton, or has now disappeared. They were a very nice family, very well educated, and generally really good people, ardent chapel goers with strong political views. Stancliffe was their middle name. They were cousins to the Stancliffes at Overhull. A scoop road ran between Broadoaks and the boathouse. It provided an exit for coal got in Whitley Wood, and delivered to the boats tied up at a staith opposite their place. After the building of the railway, a wooden bridge was made to run inside the bridge on Stennard Lane. The man with the horse on the bank would walk along the bridge with the rope end, while the horse kept to the road under the bridge, to be united with the rope at the other end of the bridge. A story used to be told of the time when the river was in flood, and some of the Waddingtons were leaving home in a pony trap, when the pony bolted and threw everybody into the river, or were drowned. After this offence was erected, largely at their expense. A few personal episodes relating to myself and the Waddingtons are worth recalling. I often had to be milk lad for them. This would be when I was about 7. One morning I had collected the half-gallon can of milk, lidless this day, from Dick Marshall's farm. At this time a huge rugby had its base there. It was alive with crows, as we called them, and the area around was liberally bespattered with white blobs. Well, suddenly I felt a big white blob sliding down my hand into the lidless can of milk. I did not know what to do, but resolved to carry on as if nothing had happened. I got to Broadoaks, gave the can a good swill round and emptied the milk into the usual bowl. Not a thing to be seen. All was well. Miss Elizabeth said good morning and told me to run to school. Nearly 100 years later, or so it seems, I sold the same Miss Elizabeth a lovely stand pie, one Christmas Eve. The week after Easter the following year, she said the pie had been lovely. They had finished at that week. It was their custom, she said, to put a spice cake and any pie they had left into an airtight box to be eaten the following Easter. This exercise was now completed for this session. They were all still alive and very weak. My little milk episode compared with this was, well, just a crow bite. Later still I bought a horse from a local corn miller. It was the worst horse I ever saw. Sometimes it would not even walk. One day, along with my father, I put it in a part set of harrows in a field up Boathouse Lane side. We were going along nicely. My father said he was going all right, when suddenly, he jerked up his head, and he was away down the field, the harrows bouncing about like shuttlecocks. My father said the hedge at the bottom would stop him, but it didn't. He went straight through, onto Waddington's front garden, and there he stood and surveyed the scene. My father said, how were we to get him back? I said, you'll have to fetch him, won't you? He said he wouldn't. I said he would because he was older than me. To save the situation, the horse himself solved it. He came back through the same hole as he went through. I never heard anything more about this. What happened I don't know. The following Sunday morning I spent a long time making him into a cast iron good worker with a scythe stone. I put harness marks all over him. He looked as he had worked day and night, and as prim and straight as a bishop. I sold him the following Monday at Huddersfield to an old fellow with a long white beard. Poor old chap, but he should have had more sense than to buy a horse he didn't know. Time rolled on, and my eldest brother went to live in a Waddington's house, a lovely house with a good garden too. I went one Tuesday tea time to see him. It was November time, but a bright afternoon, just a touch of frost. I looked through a dividing hedge and saw in Waddington's garden, yes, the same garden, a big pheasant. He looked like a coloured turkey. One of the afternoon's last rays of sunshine caught him. He looked lovely. I quietly got my brother's gun, put a cartridge in, crept back to the hedge, and bang, I got him all right. I knew that the Waddingtons were away on Tuesdays, so no danger there. My brother envisaged the direst things happening. He told my mother, who said in a loud voice that the worst thing would come to pass, and that I must not fetch it, let them think someone else had shot it. But she also told me privately, and in a much quieter voice, to wait until it was properly dark, before I got him. Get him I did. He was a good bird. So much for the Waddingtons. They were good people, and I hope they are all in heaven. I think they will be. They never did much wrong. As we leave the Boathouse Waddington enclave, we pass on the new road, Stennard Lane, towards Hopton proper. We first encounter a really delightful place, the old wire mill. It has now been modernized, but I think without unduly robbing the place of the old mill atmosphere. In the old days it was operated by the Hamerton family. A board fastened to the outside wall facing the road announced to the world that Joe Hamerton, wire worker and cab proprietor, carried on business there, although I do not think that the cab business operated this century. The place was driven by a huge water wheel fed from a dam that almost adjoined the house. The dam was fed by a very ingenious system. A much smaller dam at the bottom of the new Hall Lane, fed by a branch of the beck that started at the clough at Whitley, provided the water supply. It ran under the road, across the adjoining field, or rather fairly near to the field wall, before emptying into the main dam. In the event of an oversupply of water or overflow at the Hag Lane end of the dam occurring, water would run back under the road to emerge in the plantation opposite, on its way to the beck, to continue its way to the river. I think the wire industry here was largely connected with the coal trade. A fantastic number of riddles were turned out, and were dispatched at a later period in the firm's history, by rail to different collieries. Prior to the railways, horses and carts would be the transport. Joe Hamerton must have been a progressive fellow. He was the first man in Mirfield to utilize the new source of power, electricity. This he did coupled with his water power, although it was only used for lighting at this time. A man called Jim Wood, who lived up Hand Bank, was the chief operator of the machinery, along usually with a boy or two. Across the road from the wire mill is a field that runs across to the river, Hepperings by name, meaning, I suppose, the field by the river. The bank near the river is artificially raised to prevent flooding, or if flooded to keep the water inside the raised perimeter, to provide in winter time a skating rink. I have not actually seen skating here, although older people have told me that in the older days, it was a very usual local sport and was illuminated by candle power. It must have been lovely. I have seen a similar sight further along Stenhard Lane in front of Coat Wall. This was illuminated by candle too. Very impressive it looked too, the candles in small coloured jars, and being hung from the trees about. People made do with the things available, and everybody was happy. Turn left now and walk a few yards up Hag Lane. On your left a fairly large brick building, now a small factory, originally built, I believe, as a coaching stable by a fellow, who it was said at the time, wished to impress one of the Miss Beaumonts at Whitley Hall. It eventually didn't work. One of the things I remember about this place was a horse-drawn manual fire engine, the type pumped by a wooden bar that ran on each side of the machine. I think that 4 men on each side were required to work the pumps. The exercise would be for the horses to gallop to the fire with the men aboard. They would find a water supply somewhere about, put a pipe end in. They were then in business. The machine was painted red and bore the name of an insurance company. It was kept in a yard here. Where it went, I don't know. I remember a fire at Battyford Flour Mill, and because it took the horse 19 minutes to gallop from Huddersfield, there was much criticism. We are in this area surrounded by reminders of life as it was in more leisurely times. Look at the little beehive kilns in the little field across the beck. When these kilns were working, the open tops received the coal in scoops that ran from New Hall Wood on a rail track. They were tipped into the kiln, fired, then the coal produced the coke required in the new industries in Mirfield, largely for malting, I should think. The gas did not matter. Nobody wanted it then. We all had oil lamps. A nice house was erected on the site and was occupied, I should think, for 100 years by the Bentley family. A son, Joseph, was quite a character, one of the few men about who was absolutely fearless. The big pots did not awe Joseph. He was a very intelligent fellow and could converse on most things, and the fact that he lived on a bit of land and occupied a house over which he had absolute jurisdiction made him unique in the area, where most ordinary fellows had to touch their cap to somebody or other, not Joseph. Apart from this Joseph Bentley, a few people who lived in the area could be truthfully described as characters, or at least as people who were worthy of note. 1. A Bill Haig, I think one of the very first engine drivers who lived in the top house of a terrace at the beck. I can just remember him. It used to be said that he walked to Leeds to see Charlie Peace hanged. Charlie the notorious murderer. A crowd of 10,000 watched the public execution. In the next house and facing the road lived William Southwood, a shepherd, who came into the area to be, yes, a shepherd and bailiff for a local landowner. He had several sons and daughters, one of whom became the wife of Dick Marshall of Hag Farm. Another son, Johnny, married a farmer's daughter at Emley. William Southwood stayed in Hopton, where some of his family still live. This corner of the beck was a fairly important junction prior to them building the Hopton New Road, that is from the beck to Boathouse Lane. It was common at this time and perfectly legal to continue up Hag Lane, cut across the wood to the right, continue up Long Jones side in the wood, and emerge at this end of Mouse Hole Lane, and thus to Whitley. I have done this trip with horses and carts many times. The actual building of the new road was undertaken to relieve unemployment. At the time, I think, After the 1870 French War, when the demand of war materials would be over and the new factories would be either out of business or working at very low rate. Again, though, in this area there was for a short time quite a spurt in the opening up of pits. Buzzer Pit, and one in New Hall Wood, the original one at the Cuckoo Hill, are examples. They were short-lived and did very little to alter the economics of the natives. The beck was just a few houses and a beck, and was a bottleneck through which people passed, on the way to our metropolis, Mirfield, or East Thorpe Lane. You could have left your home in Whitley, Briestfield, Grange Moor, Lisle Lane, the Toppets district. Perhaps you lived in one of the big houses, of which there were several round about. You could have descended literally via Long Jones, Crowcroft, the Brian Knoll, or the Toppets and New Hall Lane, but to get to Mirfield you had first to pass the beck. In a day's time, if it be nice, you could spot people from all these districts, perhaps a collier from Grange Moor, going to the station to collect a poor little school lad from an orphanage in Liverpool. Perhaps two brothers would be collected. They would look like frightened birds as they peered up at their new protector. Little did they know what was in store for them, a long day in some pit, pushing scoops, trams, call them what you like, 5, 6 days a week, perhaps 10 hours a day. Their newfound benefactor had given them a home, and hard job to go with it. A lot of these lads were killed in the 1914-18 war. As they got a bit older they would come down into Mirfield to the newfangled pictures at Mirfield Town Hall. 1 pence for the pictures, 1 pence for fish and chips, and 1 pence for a bottle of pop. The biggest noise would be Hebblethwaite's Waite's farm dog prints letting off steam, perhaps occasionally a beeling cow that had just missed her calf, perhaps the cuckoo calling. You could sit and listen and watch the world you then knew pass by, if it was a warm day with your feet in the beck. Suddenly you would hear the orderly clop of horses' feet. A stylish pair of horses yoked to a lovely carriage would be coming along the road. It came from Coat Wall, a lovely place with its back nearly to Hag Wood. Passing it and going the other way, a pair of horses and carts taking coal from Whitley to Dewsbury or Ravensthorpe. From September to April, Jack Matthewman would pass you with his 3-horse team leading barley from the station to a kiln at Shepley Bridge. He used to put 4 tons at a time on a tremendous wagon built for the job. On a Monday after 4 o'clock you would see Mr. Dawson. All the lads knew Mr. Dawson. He was a master at the reformatory school, and collected lads from the train, at Mirfield station, usually from Sheffield, where they would have been sentenced to some years at the school for some offence in their home city. They always looked poor, little, thin lads, with white pasty faces. Some looked fairly wick, others sickened with the business and mostly in rags. Sometimes there would be 5 or 6 of them in a little gang. Mr. Dawson, who looked a giant in those days, would shout at them to keep them together and get them through Hag Wood, to the school. They never tried to run away on a Monday night. Some did on a Tuesday night though. At school time next morning when we were already 4 off, my mother would say, "Oh dear, look at those poor lads again." Perhaps there would be 2 or 3 this time in the custody of the keepers, who I think got paid for capturing these poor kids. My mother would cry and call out to the keepers not to hurt them. But this part of our home ground was heaven itself. Everything that God intended man to enjoy was here: lovely woods, fields, becks. All the wild animals and birds that the country lad lived with, scores of rabbits, pheasants, a hare or 2, a hedgehog, sometimes a weasel. You might hear his prey screaming out if he had not been quick enough to get away. You might find a partridge nest with a dozen eggs in. These you had to surrender to the keeper. I once sat on the wall near the bottom of New Hall Hill, listening to a grass drake calling, now under my feet, the next call far away by the iron hurdle fence, the next in the middle of the field where the wild dog daisies grew. A newborn foal and its farm mare mother, called Violet, were near to the last call. She held her head high and still. She seemed to be listening. Then a few pulls of the longer grasp. Now another listen. This time she moved away in an excited manner, called to her foal and whinnied again. Her ears pricked. She now left her foal and galloped towards me, swung round and held her head high, called again for her foal to join her, listening. This time I could hear the noise that upset this poor mare. It was an aeroplane, the first ever seen here. I saw it quite plainly, and ran home to tell mother. It did not seem long before I saw one of these things at Ypres, with a chap hanging out trying to kill me with a machine gun. If you could spare the time, you could wait by head both weights, have a bit of crack with one of the lads. Ernest was my pal at this time. Maybe sit on the wall, hear the birds sing, watch the fancy horses trot by, the farmer horses rattling the chains of a set of plough gears or mowing tackle, if in winter time a heavy sledge with broad wooden skids which would ride over the hard road. Perhaps watch my father pass with a young horse in some breaking tack, driving him quietly in a pair of long lines. Occasionally he would put me carefully on his back. He might speak very gently to him in a soothing voice to see how he framed with a lad on his back. Every Monday we would see the blind man and his wife. The man would have a strap over his shoulder and every hole of the strap would carry a brush head. His wife carried reels of cotton, pins, lace, safety pins, cards of wool, most little domestic things in a basket. They would start at the Ship Inn, Mrs. Normanton's, and call at all the cottages, all the outlying farms. He was blinded in the pit and never again able to work. They were nice people, and this was their way of life ever after. Sometimes on a Saturday tea time we might see Winnie Waxlight, a little old gypsy woman who came from Lepton. She would call at all the farms and outlying cottages trying to sell little tiny brooches, black lead, boot polish, the type you spit into and polish when it gets dry. She would sell lamp wicks. My mother used to buy lamp wicks from her, occasionally a lamp glass to fit our lamp, usually our best lamp which we used on Sunday. My mother would trim the wick, polish the glass, and we would be ready for another reading from Mother's last words. Perhaps 5 or 6 of us. Higher, higher, up she trod, until she reached those golden gates. But a wicked sprite, as black as night, sped close behind with rapid feet. Then somebody would cry aloud. My mother would cry and wallop the loudest crier for making too much noise. She would wipe her tears away, turn the lamp up and start again. This lamp was lovely and shed a soft mellow light. It was our sole means of illumination, apart, of course, from the humble candle. No electric light, not even gas, no cars, buses, radio, television, no aeroplanes apart from the one we have just seen. The pictures were just about to start, and believe it or not, no WCs, just one had been installed at this time in one of the stately homes nearby, but the man only half did the job. He got the half all right where you pulled the chain, but after that little exercise, nature took control, and assisted by the force that made Sir Isaac Newton famous, all meandered on its way to the sea, along hedge bottoms, old drains, into a field dyke perhaps, all on the way to the sea at Hull, after a brief call at the ship. But everybody lived, most folks were happy. You could go to the Flower Pot or the Ship with a shilling and get 7 pints. If we could go back to those days and those things, live at the same slow speed, with things at the same prices, and the ordinary man, instead of having 16 shillings a week, could have, well, how much? 16 pounds. Heaven would be here, allied of course to the non-existent things that we quote. There was a perpetual shortage of money, but about this there was one virtue, if virtue it was. There just wasn't any money about for the ordinary fellow. I once heard an old woman in Hopton say that she didn't believe anybody who said they had money left on a Thursday, but everybody was alike, some more alike than others, some way we did not have the pretenders that seem to be about today. Everybody seemed to manage some way or other. Just about this time employment was really bad, and the attraction of the colonies, Canada especially, held out hopes for the future that seemed non-existent here. The Hearst lads from the boathouse, Francis and Arthur and I believe another brother, went there. George Firth, whose mother had a hat shop in Knoll Road, went to New Zealand, and came over again as a soldier in the 1914-18 war. George Scott from the Knoll was a butcher and a bit of a case. Prior to going to Canada, he worked for a period as a butcher for the co-op. One day, a gardener from one of the big houses had called to pay his boss's bill, and accused him of overcharging them. George in turn accused the gardener of being a so-and-so and mentioned in detail and with great colour the denomination to which he belonged, especially on a Sunday. George's final ultimatum was if he did not apologize, he would get his head chopped off. You bloody ... Needless to say, the threat had the desired effect. George went to Canada in pursuit of gold. He worked his way across the Atlantic and fired an engine across the prairie to Dawson City, where he got a job as a barman for a time. He saved quite a good sum and, he said, bought a donkey and some tack, and set off to the gold fields. When he got to the area where the claims were to be marked out, he found it was like being at the bottom of Dransfield Hill at Hopton, only white over with snow, and all the likely claims were already allotted. He pulled up with some more lads who were equally unlucky. They were hungry and dirty, and pestered George to kill the donkey. He got what he wanted for it in cash, killed and dressed it. He said it was lovely, that it had reminded him of being at home when his mother would buy some old cow from a cow butcher. The thing that reminded him, he said, was that it was just as bloody tough, only more so. Anyway, he never left it until it was all eaten, and he sold the donkey tail to an Irish man for 10 shillings. That was the end of that. But George was an ardent gambler and went to a saloon one night. He got more to drink than he should have and said goodbye to his last quid from the sale of his poor donkey. He ended up skinned, but took note of the chap who had skinned him. He too seemed to be suffering from an overdose of whiskey. George waited until this fellow had to leave the room, followed him outside and, so he said, hit him with a wooden stake, rolled him into a ditch adjoining the saloon, and was about to go through the chap's pockets when some other fellow came along. George decided to wait until the morning to complete his nefarious scheme. This he did. The man was as dead as a stone. What he had done with the cash he had taken from George he could not tell. It was not there, but he had a gold watch and chain which George said he took with the intention of borrowing some cash on it. And then, he said, if the chap came round, he would give him his watch back, and that, George said, was the only bloody gold I saw in Canada. He told me this tale a dozen times, and always insisted on its veracity. I once saw George fall from the top of the steps to the bottom at Mirfield station. He still had his bowler hat on when he arrived. He dusted his light blue overcoat, which nearly trapped his toes, it was so long, adjusted his hat a little, then set off to walk home to the Knoll. He finished up selling buns from a basket, but George would live when most chaps would die. I have almost overrun my perusal of the Beck stories. One, closely related to the area, is fairly important. It is the story of the hedge or hedges that start really near Lyell Hall. When you enter the top, it's by the gate off Lyell Lane, near the Hare and Hounds. You are about to pass a fairly historic hedge, starting when you encounter the second gate. The hedge on your right hand, or on the south side of the path, starts here, and I am almost sure dates from a good few hundred years ago. It would be planted according to a plan operative at the time of the Dransfield family and during the period of their residence at Lyell Hall, or its forerunner. If you look, you will see that it is composed of usually 5 different types of tree: sycamore, ash, maple, thorn and holly. Occasionally, elder, looked upon as a weed, will have become established. This type of hedge continues until the wall starts near the 3rd gate, where of course the wall takes over until, having reached the spring wood bottom, and the bottom of the bridle path at wood bottom, we now find that the hedge on both sides of the path is composed of the trees I have mentioned. This continues until we are near Oid House Lodge, where a thorn hedge takes possession on the south side of the bridle path, and is so until we are near the Hag, where it is perhaps slightly mixed again. We descend Newhall Hill to the top of Boathouse Lane, where on the right side of the road, or the south side, the mixture of trees is again complete, only unfortunately, it has been so mutilated in some stretches as to be almost non-existent. Years ago, when it was kept in trim, it was a picture in autumn, when all the different coloured leaves were maturing at different times. I think that this type of path demarcation had some religious significance. This was the route that would be followed daily by the Dransfield family on their way to Mirfield Church via the boathouse, for which they were responsible, and the boat that was kept there would be in daily use. These people were tremendously powerful in the area, and were largely responsible for the handing over of the advowson of Mirfield Church to the Priory of Kirklees in the early 1300s, a long time before the appearance of the Beaumonts on the scene. This type of marker for religious routes was, I think, fairly common, and had one great virtue: it was nearly everlasting, as witness of our local example. I think that the oldest family in Hopton, and probably Mirfield, the Hebbolthwaits, would be connected with this coat-producing business their land adjoined. They were good sound people, and their Sheepings farm, still intact, is a little oasis in the midst of change. All my life it has been a hive of agricultural industry, a big stackyard at harvest time, a picture of trim stacks, properly thatched, and at threshing time, buzzing for a week with the sound of Hampshire's threshing machine. I can see and hear it all now, the men carrying the full bags of corn to the granary, another son building a stack with the newly threshed bats of straw. The boss himself, Abraham Hebbolthwaite, seeing that all was right. He was the absolute embodiment and example of the yeoman as you would picture him, a giant of a fellow in all ways. He was tall, well built, wore a good suit always, and a blue and white spotted stock, a good white collar, and all crowned by a box hat. He did not carry a stick as any little drover would. He carried a long staff and walked up the middle of the lane, a bit of an autocrat, not much to say, and most of all a gentleman, measured not by today's gold standard, but by the bit of good breeding that showed through as it did in all the good cattle and horses that he kept. Another 2 similar gentlemen spring to my mind: John Farrer of Moorlands Farm, and William Sheard of Balderston Hall, all farmers, all gentlemen according to the old book, and all as sound as York Castle. So much for the families living on this riverside road, a road that stretched from the bridge at Hopton to the Ship Inn at the other end. Coal did for a period provide the basis of the economy of the area, although it was so for a shorter period than we should probably think. 100 years would see the start and finish of the whole exercise, and I should think that a fair amount of money would be lost. If we start at the Ladywood end of the series of pits and dayholes involved, we shall be surprised. The exit for coal from this dayhole was a paved way for horse traffic that joined the road near the ship. I should think that this place shut down in the 20s. We next come to the end of the Scoop Road at Broad Oaks, and Staith immediately opposite. Boats tied up here were horse-powered, the horse walking on the roadside. I think that this finished business last century. The Buzzer Pit would close in the very early 1900s. It was never a paying proposition. Water was the problem. Another pit, probably to work the same coal seam, was sunk in Newhall Wood. An engine house and other pit-head buildings were erected, But this place never got a shovelful of coal and was eventually pulled down. The stave built to deal with coal from the buzzer pit survived for a long time just over the hedge on Granny Lane in a field called Little Stennard. The stave that dealt with coal that came to the light in the coal yard at Hopton also managed to remain intact until well into this century. Although coal has always been fairly prominent in the area as supplying fuel on the one hand and work on the other, strangely enough, in a very detailed survey required by the Domesday Book no mention is made of coal. We lie well within the area that was totally devastated in 1069 by William the Conqueror, and it was well into the 12th century before the district showed signs of recovery. Wood and peat were the fuel used, and these in great quantities. Of course there was good supply to hand, the whole of the area being well wooded, as indeed it is now. Surprisingly, ironstone was mined in the area in great quantities, and at Cone Bridge a forge or bloomery, as they were called, was erected. This dealt with the ironstone mined beyond Boyf Hall and on to the North Moor and up to Rastrick. Small diameter shafts were sunk. When the desired depth was reached, the ore was mined on all sides of the shaft, thus producing a bell-shaped area, hence the bell pits that we have read of. The whole of this business was conducted by monks connected with various religious houses. However, whether these people were the originals of this industry we do not know. This lack of knowledge regarding the industry at this time is solely due to the absence of any records relating to it. The monks, on the other hand, left detailed accounts of the whole industry, their pit sites, fuel sources, amounts of iron produced, etc. The forge at Cone Bridge was owned by the monks of Fountains Abbey, and it is recorded that a fellow called Ralph Fitz-Nicholas, of Cridling Stubbs, gave them permission to take the wood they required from his woods at Bradley, and also any iron that they came across. A strip of land behind Whitley village and running back to Long Causeway was the scene of extensive iron mining, and the place from which the mineral had been taken were plainly visible when I was a boy. I should think that the iron mined here would be taken to a forge at Flockton. This was owned and operated by the monks from Revall Abbey. All these religious houses owned and farmed vast areas of land, and iron was required in large quantities both for their farming and building operations. All these activities persisted until the end of the 13th century, when coal was being more mined in increasing amounts. With the mining of coal becoming an increasing industry in the 14th century, the smelting of iron in the area by the use of wood or charcoal for fuel rapidly declined. The foundry at Cone Bridge closed down, although this was largely due to the exhaustion of the supplies of ironstone in the area up to Rastrick. Any smelting required from this time was carried on at Low Moor, where another seam of ironstone was worked, and a foundry erected which functioned for a long time. With the commencement of the Industrial Revolution, coal was required, and in the late 1600s was being mined in greater quantities and at a large number of points. In our own area this situation persisted for a long time, in fact until the late 1930s, when a number of pits and dayholes closed down. Conditions of work in these places was very harsh, hours were long, pay low, lack of supervision through any official source was responsible for large numbers of accidents with usually a terrible death toll. Strikes were frequent, but did not achieve what they should have done. I knew one pit where the owner said that because he only made £6,000 profit in the current year, instead of the £12,000 he had made in the previous year, he had lost £6,000, and if the men would not take a substantial reduction in wages, he would shut the place up. They would not work for less, so close down he did. Most of the men never worked again, but the boss died. I believe at the time that they had £1 a week for 6 days. Chapter 9. For a long time the Oakes family carried on a wheelwright's business in Hopton off Waste Lane. The last proprietor being Walter Oakes, He would build a cart or wagon absolutely and completely by hand. He would start wheels from scratch with blocks of ash, and he would drive, which is a very descriptive word in the circumstances. The spokes for the wheels and riven spokes, as distinct from sawn spokes, would last almost forever. The moufs would be cut from blocks of oak or elm, and bound with 2 iron band. I have seen him with a finished cart so nicely balanced that he could lift it off the bucksticks with 1 finger and slowly let it go back to rest on them. He was a dab hand at lettering and the general decorating of carts. His customers were farmers who also did a bit of coal and barley leading, mill owners and co-ops who usually kept their tackle in good trim. Elsewhere in this book is a picture depicting the wheel hooping procedure. Although Walt Oakes did not actually do the hooping, I've no doubt he could do so. This part of the wheel-making job was done at Shepley Bridge by Bill Normington. Walt Oakes would get the unhooped wheel to Hopton Lane Top and await a cart laden with coal on its way to Dewsbury. He would hoist the wheel on top of the coal for its trip to Bill Normington, and the reverse would obtain for the return trip. Probably the same horse would later be pulling the cart furnished with the new wheels. This craft was one which depended solely on the man. No amount of fancy tackle, even if available, would have been much use. It was the man's know-how which made the cart. Another operated on Lyle Lane near the Hare and Hounds, another near the blacksmith's shop on there did a bit, although his business was really that of estate joiner. His shop is now a slaughterhouse. Another one in Lower Hopton near the Volunteer Pub was a shop which did all the jobs connected with the trade, including the hooping business, which I will try to describe. This business operated for a long time at the bottom of Johnson Street at Hopton near the Volunteer Pub. The art of hooping a wheel with an iron tire must now be nearly lost. A strip of iron, usually 3 wide, would be measured with the ends welded together in the shop. It would then be wheeled out of the yard where a fire had been lit, a fire just the circumference of the wheel, and kept going at a great heat by an underlying perforated pipe operated by bellows in the shop. In the meantime, the wheel to be hooped was placed on the steel table shown here. The wooden pole with the chain attached would be tapped quickly all round. Now the pole with chain would again be swung around. It would lift the complete wheel and drop it into the adjoining well. A series of terrific bangs and cracks would ensure us the tire was tightened. It was fast on forever now, and could last any cart the whole of its working life. The shop belonged to Halmshaw Brothers, but one of its regular craftsmen was Eddie Whitehead of Woodcock Hole. With the decline in the horse-drawn transport, trade of the type we describe became very steady. In fact, apart from the local farmers, the trade was nearly finished, but the one in Lower Hopton remained fairly busy until their proprietor's death, with a largely unexpected source of business, that of carts and wagons for gypsies, which this shop did in fair numbers. A fellow called Benny Smith, who usually wintered at Hartshead, had almost always 1 or 2 carts on the stocks. He would pay usually £100 at a time, and when this was absorbed would pay again, always in advance. Another good customer was a Newcastle gypsy called Shafto, who adapted the same procedure. He would send cash by road with some of his tribe and was always well covered. When complete, these carts and wagons were sent by rail from Mirfield to Newcastle. They were works of art when finished, scrolls, flowers and beautiful lettering, all in gold leaf, not gilt-paned. Thus has a little village craft and business said goodbye. The Hopton side of the river usually produced the militant types, the boxes, wrestlers, poachers, cricketers, footballers, current spell players, in fact, the fellows who, in modern parlance, dare stand up and be counted. The Smith brothers from Upper Hopton, famous cricketers in their time. All the Appleyard lads who are famous for everything. Some more families who lived nearer the river, who produced lads who would take anybody on at Headingham. They would gamble everything away, and then give up, tell their mother they would never do it again, then next morning try to borrow a shilling from her and swear to give her £1 back. But in addition to all these sports, we also had a far more serious section of the community, people who were concerned with the spiritual side of life, with education, with the need for saving and some financial stability. Although this latter was a difficult proposition, there was nothing to save, or very little, but people saved pennies and halfpennies, and perhaps over a lifetime left enough to buy a coffin and a good tea for the people he left behind. Religious persecution was rampant in the area in the 1600s. Nonconformity was alive and practiced in farm buildings, lives, odd houses. One at Upper Hopton became famous as a meeting place. The chapel near the river was born here, at Chapel Hill, as it became known. Richard Thorpe, a forerunner of the educationalists who were later to become more numerous, took part in the services, I believe. Also the Ingham family from Blake Hall, who were amongst the leading dissenters at the time. The Baptists, who came to life at this time, sometimes conducted their devotion actually on the riverside near the corn mill at Newgate. All these people were persecuted for their belief. It is hard to imagine people with feelings so intense today. One of the most important outcomes was the determination to improve life through learning, both spiritual and academic. It was a gesture of defiance. It was not the intention of the powers that be, that the masses should become aware, through the ability to say, A, B, C, or to count up to 10, of the state of the world generally. The good things that nature provided were a closed book to most people at this time. The bare necessities of life were the only things that counted. The provision of schools by these religious offshoots of the official church were a gigantic achievement. Imagine the cash required to build a school similar to the Hopton Chapel School, a standing monument to the determination of these people. A perusal of the famous people who have passed through the doors of this building are amazing. Long lists of men who have passed on to become important in the commercial life of the country, scholastic, banking, shipping, and public office generally. All taught by the masters and mistresses provided by the various chapels. Churches were later to become involved. The Wesleyan school at Wateroyd still continues to function, now of course under the wing or foot. As you view the circumstances of the local authority, personally I think it has a very good record. The school at Hopton operated on a ready cash basis. You paid your 2 pence a week, school wage it was called, and finished a good scholar, able to write copperplate when you were 6 years old, become an expert mathematician, skilled in the arts and also a good knitter, boys and girls alike. The teachers were very good. In my time the Kay sisters, not the ones on television, Emma, Emily and Gladys, were magicians. They taught every mortal thing, including singing, sewing, knitting, and painting any laggard on any subject ruled the day. These lasses were dab hands at braying it in, and bray it in they did, mostly by hand, sometimes with a stick, but they were respected and usually liked. They certainly produced results. I only came across one lad to whom reading and writing were as big a mystery when he left school as when he started. We daily are treated to long diatribes in the press, on the television, or by the local clever clogs in the deterioration of the behavior of children today. They are more violent than ever. They lack respect for their elders. In fact, there is not much that is right about them. Listen to this. One afternoon, Mr. Edwards, the schoolmaster, was taking a class in the classroom behind the gallery at Hopton. Suddenly, there was commotion in the main room outside. Mr. Edwards left his class to investigate the affair. He found the teacher of the class on the floor, standing over him a big lad who was evidently the victor. Mr. Edwards stopped the fight. Peace was restored and learning resumed. The teacher was called Frank Brooke. He left Hopton and became a policeman, a chief constable, an inspector of constabulary, a knight and a lot more things. His opponent I have referred to in a poaching incident when he was shanghaied. Do you remember? I dare not tell you his name, he has relatives in the village. This incident would not be isolated, although I am not suggesting that it was usual for scholars to set about the teacher. It happened nearly 70 years ago and was one of many affrays involving young people. I do not think that children are either better or worse than they ever were. Holidays were the things that were wholly good. A hot summer's day when you could dam the beck up at Collywood, take your boots and stockings off, your breeches too if they got wet, paddle all day until you were dyed like a red Indian with the ochre water and the sun, asleep in the long grass, drying your legs, perhaps your bottom and tummy, listen to the grass drake calling in the field corner where you were laid, his next call at the other end of the field. Listen to the cuckoo, the thrush, the blackbird, hear the spink call spink, spink, all day long. Watch old Bonnie the farm mare tossing her head incessantly to get rid of the flies. These were happy, happy days, and they cost nothing. They are all here today too, but no longer fashionable. Not all, I am wrong, you can no longer hear the grass drake call, and only infrequently hear the cuckoo. One of my neighbors used to complain that we were cuckooed to death and he'd screw his neck round it he could catch him. All these days were happy days. Everything was geared to the speed of the horse. It was a day's journey to Leeds, Bradford and Halifax, half a day to Huddersfield, a full day to Marsden or Slaithwaite or anywhere in the Colne Valley, and now another method of leisurely travel. I can remember my mother along with a lady called Mrs. Sykes and her husband William Sykes, travelling by a steam-powered river yacht called the Rook, tied up at a staith near the bottom of Boathouse Lane. They went to Stamford Bridge on the River Derwent. It was a lovely boat, everything so cosy, facilities for cooking, good seating and a fair turn of speed, measured, I presume in knots per hour or mile, I don't know. Anyway, it was a great affair and lasted from Saturday dinner time until Sunday night when they duly disembarked at Burns Staith outside the ship. This would be about 1904. It nearly sounds like 100 years ago. The boat belonged to Joseph Wheatley of Hobden, and only recently I saw a photograph of the boat with a party aboard and about to sail, the men in dress of the time and the ladies likewise. Spacious days when time didn't matter, money went a long way, beer was 2p a pint at Mr. Norminton's ship inn alongside the river. The rendezvous of the working boatmen of the area. Dressed in their best blue suits, they were very smart chaps, bell-bottomed trousers, a double-breasted jacket with velvet collar, a good blue jersey and a pair of good boots, a billycock hat and usually a white silk dog knot or muffler. But best of all, at this time the Jones had not arrived. Who cared you know what so and so had or did? Chapter 10. We cannot leave Hopton without recording the means of transport, the hansom cab, the ordinary four-wheeler, or the wagonette. The hansom cab was an elegant affair, a two-wheeler, usually a dark green body and yellow wheels, the driver high above the whole contraption. It was usually hired by the better-off customer, a well-known cab proprietor in the village, Joe Woodcock, bought one almost especially for the use of E.B. Wilson, town clerk and solicitor. John Tippling, another owner, had one on hire, usually driven by the best-known driver in Yorkshire, Joe Miller. Joe was once hired by a railway contractor called Jim Pearson, who lived in Hopton, to take him to Grangemore races. They arrived all right and arranged a rendezvous for 1 hour later. At the subsequent meeting there was bad news for Joe. His fare had had his gold watch and chain and sovereign case pinched and was all for calling the police. But Joe counselled patience, and they arranged another meeting 1 hour hence. The hour passed and Joe had news. He had found the burglars all right. Mr. Pearson was again eager to call the police, but Joe had made better provision for the recovery of the valuables. They had to be at the fountain at the head of Mirfield Moor at 7 o'clock that night with £12, when the loot would be restored to the owner. They got back down to Mirfield. Joe changed horses, picked his fare up, and was away up Sunnybank, to be at the fountain at 7 o'clock. The burglars were already there. Although one of them was a teetotaler and preached daily about the evils of smoking and drinking, he ordered whiskies for all, excluding, of course, himself, all to be paid for by the fortunate watch owner. He duly handed over the £12. When Joe was given £2, the paymaster inquired what this was for. He was told for looking after the. He was also told not to lose or sell the watch, as they might require it again. Jim was eager to get back down into Hopton again, but Joe could not oblige. He had other and now more important business on hand. These burglars, or call them what you will, were well-known local fellows. They were 3-card men, besides not being adverse to a spot of picking pockets. They seemed to prosper and both had small farms, one of a particularly benevolent appearance in his parson hat and frock coat. He had a nice daughter who married a well-known Mirfield lad. This cad was used by a well-known pillar of the church when visiting his girlfriend in Huddersfield. She was not just his friend. On one of these visits Joe had a tour of exploration in the vast cellars of the girl's house at Edgerton and found bottles of champagne all laid out on their straws. He borrowed 2, and on the way home next morning his fare rattled the top of the hansom. He dismounted, opened the cab door, and was asked how much he would take for the champagne he had pinched. Joe denied this, but when told they had cost his fare 25 shillings, he said he could have one for the same price, and they drank champagne up Leeds Road at 4 o'clock in the morning. I dare not tell you who the fare was, you wouldn't believe me. Joe Mellor had been a postboy on one of the very last coaches to run from Dewsbury. He was in great demand at weddings when he would drive a pair of greys if the bride could afford it, or just one grey if they were poor. It was said that if he had a wealthy client on a Saturday night he would stand him on his head and shake him until all his cash dropped out. He was a good fellow and lived until he was well turned 90. Incidentally, at the Grange Moor races I have just been to, my father trained 3 horses and they all won. Redbrook, Redfinch, and my girl. Quite a feat, I should think. I had my photograph on the front page of the Daily Sketch. The following Monday, I led from the ring the winning mare Redbrook, with my father just behind me. The caption over the photo: the Pitman's Derby on the Yorkshire Moors. I should be 9 or 10 at this time, and as Grange Moor races were one of the red-letter days in the year, the incidents above lasted for another year in all the pubs and farm stables after laying away time. But all days were not race days. The band rarely played, and the sun didn't always shine. For some it never seemed to shine. Employment was generally a very spasmodic business, affected by wars, both at home and abroad. During a war, work would be good. Cloth was required from the newly built mills, coal to fire them, railways to move the products, but when it was all over, bang, work was finished. This state of affairs always persisted. The mill owners applied the sacking and short time approach. The railways had men working for very low wages, and jobs on any of the different companies' lines were coveted, usually in preference to one in the new textile industries. But to get a railway job there were many preliminaries. Knowing the immediate foreman or chief clerk helped. It also worked in the factories. A foreman would be paid perhaps a shilling or 2 a week more than the other men, then became a bigger tyrant than the boss, which was the way it was intended to work. Rough times usually caught the women and children first, in spite of the low cost of food. If cash was not available to buy it, it might as well have been 1,000 times more. Milk was 1 shilling 6 a pint, and old milk, or skim milk, which the farmers sold at 1 shilling 2 pence, but if you had not the pence required, well, you didn't buy it. It seems like 100 years since the old school days in Hopton, But I can well remember lads bringing bread to school with lard plastered on instead of butter. One family I remember well, in addition to eating this combination, had the additional penance of burnt bread. These lads had to wrestle with their burnt offerings every day. It wasn't half burnt either. The sole and the top were like tarred felt. I once heard a farmer say he'd never seen any meat he couldn't swallow. These lads performed the swallowing trick daily. Yes, down it all went. If a lad had an apple he was a king, and would be surrounded by a motley crew all begging for the coke, the core in Hopton lingo. Seeing that Mirfield was then almost a rural area with huge gardens all producing the basic needs, it rather emphasizes the poverty of the ordinary man. The cash just was not there. Epidemics would sweep the area: scarlet fever, smallpox, diphtheria. The schools would close for weeks on end, and when it was all over, some poor little lass or lad would be missing. The fever van would carry scarlet fever victims to hospital, and its appearance would strike terror into your young heart. It was a dark brown-black affair, built like a cabin, drawn usually by a butcher's horse. The same horse you had an hour before flying on East Flop, and ridden by a butcher lad, his smock flying out behind him and shouting for you to get out of the way. But this was a more serious job than taking chops to Blake Hole. Some poor kid would be carried out from a house in one of the narrow streets by a nurse. He would be wrapped in a blanket, laid on a seat in the van. The black window door would close. The driver would give the familiar click with his tongue. The butcher's horse would start off. This time not to Blake Hall, but to the hospital at Nick House, and if all went well the lad would return after 6 weeks. Immediately after the departure of the fever van, a man would come from the council to stove the house. All nicks and cracks were plastered up inside, and on his departure the man would plaster all round the door with white paper. Every nick was covered, even the keyhole. The occupants had to remain outside for a long time. I forget how long. Thus did we fight the fever in older days. The operation was called stoving, and I presume consisted of burning some disinfectant. After the lockout period the set pot would be put on, and everything washable would be washed, including all the children who had up to date escaped the onslaught. These were bad times, but it is said that wars usually throw up people to deal with them. So with domestic affairs, the mothers of this time could deal with and surmount almost anything. It used to be said that some women could make a good dinner out of the dishclout, and so it was. A penny worth of suet, a penny worth of bones, a handful of flour, a scrape of treacle, and you had a dinner fit for the king, and a good smell that brought all the dogs in the village to the door. Homemade clothes were the vogue at turn of the century. Sewing machines were just out, and a few fortunate households usually had one. A lad in a suit made from a jacket that his mother wore before she got married were fairly common, as were cut-down breeches inherited from his dad or older brothers. My mother once had a long cape that would have covered a load of hay. She had discarded this in favor of one a bit more fancy, and decided that she would make me a suit from the now redundant one. The cloth was nearly half an inch thick with fancy braid on, but she made it on her new machine. It should have been made in a foundry. Every morning she had to catch me, get an elder sister to hold me until she had slotted me into it. I was enclosed until bedtime in it. There was no escape. To get out myself I should have required a spanner or a hacksaw, and to make it worse, my eldest sister knitted me a pair of stockings to go with it, and they were like motor tires. Big squares were the pattern, but the gods helped me. I quickly grew out of the contraption. My mother gave the whole ensemble to a poor little lad who easily slid into it, but he never grew a bit after this time. The people of this area were a hard-bitten breed. Obstacles were put there to be surmounted. You might be turned off your place, lose your job, lose a leg or arm in the half-equipped pits or factories, but life had to be lived, and somehow it did continue. But the biggest trial ever to be endured by the people of this valley was yet to come. It gets nearer and nearer. It is the 1914. War has started, and here it is over the river which has been the life of our village, and which over the years has been the boundary between the two nations, will run salt with the tears of fathers and mothers, sweethearts and wives, and red with blood of the lads who have died, lads from the wild moorlands at Stanage, from the little ploughs and gindles of Hebden Bridge, down through our own Hopton on Granny Lane, on Stenhard Lane to our own ship inn, and tomorrow I am going for a soldier myself. I am 17 years old, nearly 18, it is 1916. Sam Speedy, or a hare pie after the first Battle of Cambria. In November 1917, in which the Duke of Wellington's regiment took a great part, I was sent on a draft to replace the killed and wounded in the battle. I eventually landed with other lads at a village called Alaun, near Bethune. The second day I was there, believe it or not, Ben Dyson, you know Ben Dyson, he lived with his mother on the riverside at Hopton. He came to me and asked me if I would be the butcher for a few days. I think their lad had got killed. Ben was a sergeant, so of course I had to say yes. I had a pal, a Whitby lad, also a butcher, who could help me. We were duly installed in a loose box in the courtyard of the mayor of the village, his name, Philip Groix. Sam was a bit of a case. He used to sing the old Whitby whaling song when he was fresh. He said if he sang at the harbour mouth at Whitby on a stormy night, they could hear him at Middlesbrough, and shipping would turn back. We were to sleep in an out kitchen, used as a quartermaster's store. An upstairs room was occupied by a big fat lass, called Isabella. Also quartered with Sam and me, was a Brusson Cockney lad called Fred Quinn, more of him later. Old Mr. Groix seemed very eager to foster a close relationship with Sam and me. If we would like to go to the big house for supper, we could join him, his wife and maid, at a great hare pie feast. He inferred that it could be even greater with the addition of a bit of beef, which we promptly supplied. The time came for the feast. At 7:30 that night, old Groix came out, marched round the yard calling, "Isabella, Isabella, Isabella." He sounded like a kid playing at engines. He little knew that Isabella was in bed, with the mighty Quinn, in the loft over the QM stores. Quinn had forfeited all his rights in the hare pie party, for a bit of fun with Isabella. Sam said he was welcome to her. I wouldn't have swapped a last week's tatty pie for her. Eventually they both made a tardy appearance at the party, but it was very good to see that Isabella wasn't very keen on the pie, although it was very good, we thought. This was the sequel. Next morning Sam and me were getting on with the job when we heard a gunshot quite near, and very quietly, a small green door in the courtyard wall opened. Old Groix looked all round and swiftly nipped across the yard to the kitchen door, carrying, what do you think? A big black tomcat by the tail. Sam nudged me to look. Well, it looks like they're having some more hare pie, Tony. If I'd known we were going to have a tomcat for its supper, I think, now, I would have swapped me share for Isabella or anybody else. What's the say? A chance meeting. Amid a welter of dying horses, dead and dying men, noise of bursting shells, and clatter of still living horses and men, the rattle of limbers, GS wagons, the shouts of men freeing the wounded or dead horses from their team, those which could still gallop, making their way from the hell through which they must pass. Along with some few more lads, I was trying to make my way out of the same hell. A shell burst near us. We made a dive into a shell hole on the roadside. We were not hurt. Suddenly, I felt a tug at my sleeve. Have you a drink of water? No, I've had no water today yet. We must have missed the cart, I said. I looked round to see who pulled my sleeve. Do you know who it was? It was George Barrowclough, of Dr. Lane. You knew George, didn't you? He had seen me before I saw him. He had no water and so far that day had had nothing to eat. He was in the same boat as me. I'd had nothing to eat since the day before, and along with others of my company were making for a church spire in a village called Elverding, a red brick church which looked far away. George was I think, with a company of engineers who were trying to repair and drain the road. He said, "We'll never get out of this bloody hole, will we?" I said, "It looked doubtful, but we'd have a try and make a run for it, George, and see what happens." He didn't reply, he just looked at me as if to say cheerio, "I'll never see you again." We made it to the church and from there to a camp called a Rilla Camp. Well, we did see each other again, didn't we? I've been in 1,000 scrapes of all kinds with George since that afternoon. Once when we went to buy some bullocks near York, and they turned out to be lions, the chap had to sell. Failing lions, would we buy some monkeys? No, we've enough effing monkeys in our village without kin anymore. But all this is another story. He was never fast, never at a loss for a reply. I might see him again sometime, but not in a hellhole like the one I describe, I hope. Do you know where it was? It was Ypres, in the spring of 1918. You will have heard of Ypres, whether you know George and me or not. Pipers. I listened intently, and thought that I heard pipe music. It was a grey cold, wet day. One of the days that you get in France at this time of the year. I was outside a village called Repute, on the Arras-Lens road. I had just seen Willie Wood, a Mirfield lad. He was Leonard's brother. He was a quartermaster sergeant, and the same night he was killed when taking the rations to the line. Suddenly, the music came nearer. It was a pipes and drums band playing troops from the front line, and I quote something I wrote 60 years ago. It was cold, miserable, misty, dark and dreary. Suddenly the sound of bagpipes, it sounded in the sky almost, sometimes a loud burst, sometimes just a whisper, coming and going with the wind. I waited a bit longer, and around the corner of a battered church, the pipers appeared. They were playing Scottish troops out of the line. These lads had been fighting for perhaps a week, coming back perhaps a yard at a time. They were torn and dirty, covered with clay and chalk. They marched with heads down, glad to be leaving the hell that was for me. This music and the beat of the drums would sound to them like the music they had learned at their mother's knee, but it would not last. No, before many days, they would march the other way, the way for a lot of them to a certain bloody death, to lie in the same cold ground where their elder brothers lie. Not for them, a lead-lined coffin, or one of stately oak, but a blanket torn from a comrade's bed, and stained with the blood and sludge in which they had lived until this day, their shrouds the sods that covered them, their monument, a rifle thrust muzzle first into the ground, to warn still living comrades to tread light over his grave in the valley, and here his birthday comes again. The wild corn will be growing through his ribs, like it does through his elder brother. This is war for the ordinary lad. The same afternoon I saw another Hopton lad, Charlie Whitehead. He had been to see if he could find the grave of another Hopton lad, George, Harry Dyson. Charlie had been told by someone, I believe, that George, Harry, was buried at Repute, but if he was, he'd never be found. The place was churned up. The church was about the only partly intact building. Poor lad, he was never found. At 2 o'clock the following morning a loud bang on the tin hut we were in was reveille. Every man, every horse on the road in 10 minutes. Every man was presented with either a pick or a shovel on falling in. This you shoved down behind your full pack, bandoliers of arms round your neck, a bag of Mills bombs laid across your full pack, anything else they could think up, they piled on your back. We marched from 2:30 that morning until 5:30 at night, full out 10 minutes per hour. The lads said that we carried all included, 90 to 98 pounds. And that we marched 40 miles, nothing to eat, a drink of water, and we had stopped when we did, because the horses were done in, all this for 6p a day, which we never got. I mentioned Sam Speedy quite a few times. Here he is in the flesh, or as near as we can get. He's sitting in front of men, just in the row from the left. If he's hit a few, he would burst forth and sing some old Whitby wailing song. He was a Whitby lad. The other lads in front were Geordies and would sing bladen races, till the cows came home. They were all very much front-line soldiers, a few of them having been wounded 2 or 3 times, all at least once. They are all tougher than they look. I watched Speedy kill a German lad with a bomb. He blew the top of his head off. Incidentally, the photo here was taken by a farmer at £1 a piece a time. The sheet hanging behind us is scenery, to obscure the farm building against which we stand. He had 2 lovely daughters who helped on the farm, but not in the photo business. In a little beck that ran through the yard and out into a field, I saw a chap's leg blown off, just below the thigh, complete with an old boot on the foot. Nobody seemed to know who the owner was. C'est la guerre. Chapter 11. Old Mirfield, and its relationship with the Priory of Kirklees. The Cistercian Priory of Kirklees was situated in the township or parish of Hartshead in Dewsbury. Its present claim to fame is its relationship with the outlaw Robin Hood. It is usually acknowledged to have been founded by one of the Fleming family, who were domiciled at that time at Worth-on-Dearne. They were a branch of the family sent originally to subdue the area by William the Conqueror, which they did in no uncertain manner. Yorkshire generally was laid waste, a scorched earth policy was enforced, and not only this, but the whole of the populace was massacred. This founder was called Reinald Fleming, and he granted to the Priory of Kirklees a stretch of land that covered the area from the old Walton Cross at Hartshead, across to Liversedge, to the Mirfield boundary, which would be roughly as it is now, that is, to the northern side of Mirfield Moor, bounded by the beck that crosses under the road at Rowhead, near the present boundary sign, and down to the river, where they also built a mill, still there, and taking in the district which we knew as Blake Law, or Low, now part of the new M62. The Priory was now the owner of this fairly big stretch of land, its meadows, waters, woods, pastures, and 12 additional acres of land which they held as tenants of the Fleming family, so that they might pray for their souls and for the souls of their fathers and heirs forever. The charter granting this land is confirmed by one William, Earl of Warren, who died in 1240, who states that the founder was the son of William Fleming, more or less fixing the date of the actual founding of the Priory in the reign of Henry II. It is usually accepted that Elizabeth de Stainton was the first prioress. This is sometimes doubted, but it is recorded that she held conversations with the Abbot of Roche, who held land from Rotherham to Saddleworth, regarding their respective domains. The Kirklees religious sphere of influence covered the same area practically as the Kirklees area of 1975, that is from the Dewsbury-Batley boundary at Morley to Stanage, still bounded there by the Friarmore area, a large part of which was held by my own ancestors, as tenants of the Abbot of Roche prior to the Reformation. This same Elizabeth de Stainton is buried in a tomb behind the 3 nuns at Mirfield. An inscription round the tomb reads, "Sweet Jesus of Nazareth, have mercy on the soul of Elizabeth de Stainton, prioress of this house." It is possible that she was the relative of Robin Hood, usually accepted as being responsible for his death by bleeding him, after which operation he shot his famous arrow. The Priory enjoyed the income from various tracts of land, benefits of crops from areas as widely distributed as Slaithwaite, Bridge, Shelf, and an especial grant of 18 acres of land and messuages at Hartshead. An inquisition was taken at York on the 22nd of January 1395, and it was decided that it was not to the injury of a king or others if the king permit a knight, John of Montaigne, John Woodhouse, and William of Landale, to grant the prioress of Kirklees 50 acres of land with the appurtenances in Mirfield, and the advowson of the church in the same place, and to find a chaplain to celebrate divine service daily in the conventual church of Kirklees, and to receive the said land and advowson, and to appropriate the said church at Mirfield to their own use forever. A later licence in 1400 mentioned in addition to the above men, one William de Dransfield. This would be the Dransfield who originally hailed from Mildley Lane. At this time the prioress was to have all tithes in the form of sheaves of corn, hay, and the whole of the fallen wood in the area, together with the use of the rectory, the vicar to enjoy any small tithes, and profits accruing from his vicariate. As part of the surrender of Mirfield Church to the prioress, the convent undertook to provide, at their own cost, a dwelling house for the vicar, and to bear all the burdens likely to occur, the vicar paying 6 shillings and 8 pence to the convent per annum for this. All their tithes in the form of corn, etc., and any other income from Mirfield Church continued to be exacted by the prioress until the dissolution, in the case of Kirklees Priory, in 1540. The 50 acres of land granted to the priory along with the advowson of Mirfield Church would, I should think, have been the land surrounding the present church and running down to the Northorpe area where the Mirfield of the 1500s was largely located. The actual 50 acres and its situation I have never seen pinpointed. In fact, the circumstances regarding the granting of this land and church to the priory gave rise to much controversy at the time. It had evidently only been a very infrequent procedure, and its legality was contested. Actually, at the time of the grant, at least in 1329, the advowson of Mirfield Church belonged to the Deborah family, and it was of such importance that eventually, a papal bull was issued by the Pope, although even this is inconclusive. The priory itself was a miserable place, badly built, largely of wood, and only being possessed of 2 chimneys. During its lifetime it was ill-conducted for a great part of the period, and was classed as a very minor priory. At one time, even after the act of suppression of monasteries had become law, it was allowed to function, but surrender shortly followed. The priory not having a clear income of £200 per annum, which the king required. The prioress at this time was Cecilia Topcliffe. At the actual closing down of the priory, the prioress was Joan Kipps. She was granted a pension of £2 per annum and along with 4 others took up residence at what we know locally as Paper Hall on Flash Lane. She lived here for a good few years and was buried in Mirfield Church. A stone recording her burial is in the old church tower, and her death is also recorded in the church register of the time. Later the Thomas Savile to whom the rectory had been granted was granted a license to dispose of all tithes, the vicarage and the advowson of Mirfield Church. It came into possession of the Armitage family of Kirklees Hall, and later it passed into the ownership of the Inghams of Blake Hall in Mirfield. At this time Dewsbury Church was an important factor in the religious life of the area, and, coupled with the authorities of the prioress of Kirklees, was dominant in the area for a long time. Hart's Head Church especially being held, or rather advised by Dewsbury. Mirfield was thus held, religiously at least, for a period stretching roughly from the late 1300s until 1540, a long time during which the people of the area would have provided immense sums and vast amounts of corn, etc., in the form of tithes. So much for the relationship of Mirfield with Kirklees Priory. Roe Head. If the Fleming family, the founders of the Priory of Kirklees, could return to the area which they dominated in the 1100s, they would see that the wheel of fortune had come full circle, and that the Catholic cause from Rome was enjoying again the freedom which we usually associate with religion. The old Row-Head House has been transformed into a beautiful and well-equipped college for the training of future priests in the Catholic faith. It looks over the whole of the former priory's land and the actual site of the buildings. During the times that the Bronte sisters were here, they must have often looked far away, across the grim hills that surround their home at Haworth, and perhaps wished they were there. Row-Head itself at this time must have been a pretty grim place. Incidentally, the name itself seems rather a puzzle. Nearly 100 years ago a signpost at the Mirfield end of Stocks Bank pointed to Lower Row on an old map. An area halfway up the Moor Road is posted as Middle Row. It is the word row that is evidently the important factor in this series of names. What it means I do not know, and have yet to meet anyone who does. The fact that the nearest big building is christened with this row is a coincidence. How we got there in older times, and two well-known Mirfield personalities. Mrs. Bob Hall lived at the bottom of Knoll Road. Her premises had formerly been a livery stable, where the cab horses for a stand at the junction of Knoll Road and Huddersfield Road formerly operated. A painted sign fastened to the wall of what is now Old Water Hall announced that it was an official stand for 6 cabs. It was properly drained and setted, and I should think that the last chap to operate from there would be old Tip John Tippling, who left there to farm and operate his cab business from Gosling Hole Farm at Hopton. I believe Billy Whitfield followed him there. You knew Billy, didn't you? Mrs. Hall was an astute businesswoman. She ran a fish and chip shop near the Black Bull, and along with her husband, Bob, and son Cecil, operated a horse-powered carrying business before the days of motors. Everybody knew them. Cecil was a household name. Well, our story relates really to Mrs. Hall. Every year she had a fantastic holiday. She had a lovely pony and governess car. The week before her trip she would get a, now older than he was then, young fellow to exercise her pony in the bull field and get him fit on stolen corn, or at least corn from her working horses. You know this young fellow. He is now rather more rotund and bigger than he was then. He's the proprietor of Messrs. Ramsden's, the painting contractors, himself a descendant of a long line of horse dealers, and himself still a horsey chap. He would help Mrs. Hall to yoke up at 6 o'clock on the Monday morning on the first day of her trip. Her target on the first day, her brother's farm at Easing Wold. She would stay the night there, yoke up the following morning, and then forward away to Hindwell, north of Whitby, where she had other kinfolk in the ironstone trade. A day or two there and then back home by the same route, and in time to open her shop on the Saturday night. She had driven there and back, 204 miles, and her pony as fit as when she left. She was a very good horsewoman, a kind and gentle person. I can see her now, with big feathers in her hat, a long tight horsey cut coat, and a trailing dark-coloured frock. There are no more like her today. She was, according to any standards, a real lady. Jack Matthew Mann, our other personality. One Thursday summer night, it would be 9 o'clock, he had 2 horses tied to the gate at the top of Boathouse Lane. He had been a few times round the field, and his mowing machine had broken down. He was laid down and taking the broken part from the machine. It was a Kersley and made in Ripon. He got the part off, cleaned it up a bit, and told me that he was going to borrow a flat cart or shandy and some light harness and drive through the night to Ripon. I helped him strip his horses of their mowing gear, and his black mare, that was now without a job, until the machine was mended. I turned out in another field. I helped him yoke his other mare called Bonnie into a shandy. He part-filled a sack with corn, put the broken part on the cart, put a handful of hay in another sack to sit on, asked me to call and tell his wife where he had gone. He jumped aboard and was away to Ripon. He did drive through the night. He got his new part, got it fixed, and was mowing again on Saturday afternoon. He himself was made of iron, never had a clock going, and was stone deaf. He would be the last shire stallion keeper in this village. Hopton Lad he was called, a truly remarkable fellow, but blessed with bad luck. He had driven 108 miles. Two well-known hymns. Jesus, lover of my soul, let me to your bosom fly, while the nearer waters roll, while the tempest still is high. This lovely hymn used to be sung each Sunday at about 12:30, by two little old ladies, standing by our front gate. As time went on they seemed to shrink, and get less and less, their sweet little voices less powerful. On a rainy day with the wind from the east, they would stand with their backs to it, facing down the lane, their poor little song floating down towards the nab. They were on their way to Easthorpe, where they had another few calls. They came from where do you think? The workhouse at Staincliffe. Oh happy days, when Jesus washed my sins away. Oh happy days, when Jesus washed my sins away. Three lads with only 3 legs between them, singing in the street at Hopton. It's about 8:30. They are trying to catch people leaving the mills at breakfast time, after sleeping out near the flower pot. They are on their way to Huddersfield with their wives and 2 children besides. It is 1919. Thousands of lads in similar straits. I am just home myself after being in France, but I have both legs on. I gave them 2 bob as did Leonard, and we both cried. The end.